I had planned this trip for months, telling myself I needed to get away from the noise of the city, the constant hum of traffic, the endless reminders of deadlines and bills. The idea of a cabin in the woods seemed perfect. Somewhere far from everything, somewhere I could breathe, think, and be alone with my own thoughts. I had packed my bag carefully, making sure I had enough food for a week, water, a small first aid kit, and the essentials: sleeping bag, flashlight, extra batteries, and a pocket knife. The cabin was tucked away in a remote part of the mountains, and the directions I had printed out were detailed, but I still expected to get a little lost along the way. I liked that idea. I liked the feeling of driving through winding roads, past dense forests, and over narrow bridges, the air changing gradually, growing cooler and cleaner as I drove higher. When I arrived at the cabin, it was even smaller than I had imagined. A single story, made of dark wood, with a stone chimney rising from one side. The windows were dusty, and the door looked solid with a rusty latch. There was a small porch with 2 chairs, and the air smelled faintly of pine and smoke, though I didn't see any sign of recent activity. The sense of isolation hit me immediately. I pulled my car to the side, grabbed my bag, and approached the cabin slowly, half expecting some neighbor or caretaker to step out and greet me. But there was no one, only the sound of the wind through the trees and the occasional bird call. I opened the door, and the smell of old wood hit me. Inside, the cabin was basic but functional. There was a small kitchen area, a table with 2 chairs, a couch that looked like it had been used heavily, and a tiny wood stove. One room served as a bedroom, with a bed that had a thin mattress, a blanket, and a pillow. Everything was covered in a thin layer of dust, but it looked livable. I set my bag down, went to the kitchen to unpack some snacks and water, and then walked around, checking the windows and doors. All seemed secure. I turned the latch on the door, making sure it closed tightly, and then went outside to look around. The forest stretched on all sides, tall pine trees, thick undergrowth, and a narrow dirt trail leading away from the cabin. I could barely see the road from here. It was quiet, almost painfully quiet, and I felt a strange mix of relief and unease. Relief because I was finally away from the city, and unease because there was absolutely no one around. The first night, I made a fire in the wood stove. I had brought a small stack of wood, and it was surprisingly easy to start a fire despite the dampness of the cabin. The flames cast flickering shadows on the walls, and I sat close to the stove, watching the fire burn and thinking about how peaceful it was. The night was dark, the kind of darkness that made it hard to see even your own hands in front of your face. I tried to sleep, but every crackle of the fire and creak of the wood made me tense. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the trees, and I could hear the occasional snap of a branch breaking under the weight of snow or ice. Somewhere in the distance, a sharp, high-pitched cry echoed through the forest. I froze, straining to hear it again. It was hard to tell if it was an animal or something else, but the sound made my stomach tighten. I told myself it was probably a fox or a coyote, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. The next morning, I woke early, bundled up, and went to explore the area around the cabin. The trail led through the forest and gradually sloped down into a small clearing where I saw a stream. The water was cold and clear, running fast over smooth stones. I drank some water, washed my face, and sat on a fallen log to take in the silence. I realized just how far I was from anyone. The nearest town was hours away by car, and even then, the roads up here were treacherous in bad weather. I walked back to the cabin, careful to mark my path so I wouldn't get lost, and spent the rest of the day chopping some firewood and organizing my supplies. The isolation was starting to feel heavier than I had expected. I realized I hadn't seen a single person since I left the main road. No cars, no signs of anyone. Nothing except trees and the occasional animal tracks. First, it was calming, but as the day went on, I noticed small things that unnerved me. The way the shadows moved in the forest, how the wind seemed to change direction suddenly, the constant scratching and rustling outside that I couldn't explain. I told myself it was normal that forests were full of noises, but I couldn't fully relax. That night, I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows. I sat near the stove again, but this time I didn't feel the warmth of comfort. My thoughts kept drifting to the possibility of someone else being out here. A hunter, a trespasser, someone who might stumble upon the cabin and find it empty. The thought made me tighten my grip on the pocket knife I had placed next to me. The next day, I decided to venture further down the trail. I wanted to find the main road, or at least a clear landmark so I could orient myself. The forest grew denser as I walked, and the trail became harder to follow. Every so often, I would come across small animal tracks, sometimes fresh, sometimes old. I saw deer tracks, rabbit tracks, and even something larger that I couldn't identify at first. I took note of the sun's position, making sure I could find my way back. About 3 hours into the hike, I realized I had gone farther than I intended. The forest seemed to press in on me, the trees growing closer together, the underbrush thicker. I stopped to catch my breath, leaning against a tree, and that's when I noticed it. Footprints. Not animal tracks, human footprints. Fresh human footprints leading deeper into the forest. My stomach sank. They weren't large, but they were deliberate. Someone had been here recently. I looked around, but I saw nothing. No one hiding, no one moving, just trees and shadows. I considered turning back immediately, but curiosity mixed with apprehension held me in place. The footprints led along the trail, and I realized they were coming from the direction of the cabin. My heart rate increased. Someone had been near my cabin. I debated what to do. Should I rush back, or try to follow them to see where they went? I decided to head back immediately. Every crack of a branch under my boots, every whisper of the wind through the leaves, made me tense. I kept my eyes on the trail, scanning for movement, but saw nothing until I reached the cabin. When I arrived, the front door was slightly ajar. My stomach dropped. I was sure I had locked it. I grabbed the handle and pulled. The door opened with a slow creak. Inside, everything looked normal at first glance. The stove was cold, my supplies untouched, and the windows still latched. But then I noticed something small on the floor. A footprint. Muddy, human, right in front of the kitchen counter. I hadn't seen it before. Panic rose in my chest. Someone had been inside my cabin. Someone had come here while I was out. I checked all the locks again, this time more carefully. I made sure the windows were secure. I realized I had no signal on my phone, no way to call for help. The nearest neighbor was miles away. I felt trapped. I spent the rest of the day preparing. I set up a small perimeter outside with sticks and stones, anything that could alert me if someone approached. I reinforced the door with a heavy chair. I gathered all the firewood inside to prevent anyone from using it. Every little sound made me jump. The wind rattling the windows, the branches scraping the roof. I tried to focus on tasks to calm myself, chopping more wood, cleaning, organizing supplies, anything to feel in control. But the feeling of being watched never left. Night came and I stayed awake for hours listening. Around midnight, I thought I heard something. Footsteps outside, careful, deliberate. I froze, straining to hear. They paused. Then the sound of crunching leaves, as if someone was walking around the cabin, checking it. My hands gripped the knife tightly. I stayed completely still, waiting, counting my breaths. After what felt like hours, the noises stopped. I didn't sleep at all that night. The cabin, once a place of refuge, felt like a trap. I realized then that being alone in the woods was not the same as being free. Alone meant vulnerable. It meant exposed. And I had no one to call, no one to help if something went wrong. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay any longer. I packed quickly, making sure to bring all my supplies and kept my knife within reach. I left the cabin through the back, avoiding the main trail where the footprints had been. I tried to move quietly, sticking to dense areas where I could hide if needed. The forest seemed even thicker in the daylight. Sunlight barely reached the ground, and shadows shifted constantly. After hours of walking, I finally found a wider trail that looked like it might lead to a road. I followed it, heart racing every time I heard a snap behind me. After what felt like an eternity, I saw a clearing up ahead. A gravel road. Cars were driving slowly past. Relief washed over me. I walked onto the road, waving my arms, and finally, a car slowed down. The driver looked concerned as I explained where I had come from. They offered to drive me to the nearest town. On the way, I kept looking back, half expecting someone to emerge from the forest. But there was nothing. No signs of anyone, no traces of footprints. Only the trees, indifferent and silent. I never went back to that cabin. I told myself I would once when I had more company, more safety measures. But the memory of the footprint in the kitchen, the sounds of footsteps at night, stayed with me. I realized that nature was not just beautiful and peaceful. It was indifferent. And when you are alone in a place like that, you are exposed, vulnerable. Even the smallest sign of another human presence becomes terrifying. In the end, I learned that the city noise, the deadlines, the constant pressure, they were easier to manage than the fear of being truly alone with an unknown threat. I told the authorities about the footprints, but they said without evidence, there was nothing they could do. I accepted that. The forest had no rules for humans. It was only survival, instincts, and chance. And I had been lucky to walk away unharmed. From that experience, I never underestimate the importance of preparation. I learned to check locks twice, to always have a plan to leave, to never assume isolation means safety. And I learned to respect the unknown, not in some mystical way, but in the real, tangible way. People can be dangerous, even in the middle of nowhere. The cabin, once a dream of peace, became a memory of tension, fear, and vigilance. Every time I think about it, I feel the weight of that emptiness, the absolute silence, and the realization that sometimes the scariest thing is knowing someone could be out there, just beyond your sight, and there's nothing you could do if they chose to approach. But I also learned resilience. I survived. I made it back to safety. I didn't panic. I stayed alert, and I trusted my instincts. That was my only advantage, and it was enough. I never returned to the cabin, but I sometimes drive by the road leading to it, looking at the trees from a distance. The forest is quiet, still imposing, but I know I am no longer the same person who once thought solitude in the woods was freedom. I know now that freedom in such isolation comes at a price. Awareness, caution, and respect for the fact that, out there, the world does not care about you. The forest is only beautiful until you realize that someone else could be in it, watching, waiting, or just passing through. And when that happens, your mind notices every sound, every movement, every shadow. I carry that memory with me, not as a haunting, but as a lesson. As I write this now, I know that I am safer because I am alert, cautious, and aware. And that is the only protection anyone can have in a place as vast and indifferent as the wilderness. I had been looking forward to this weekend for weeks. The idea of leaving the city behind, escaping the constant hum of traffic and the endless notifications on my phone, was like a balm to my nerves. I had rented a small cabin deep in the woods, far from any main roads, and I planned to spend 2 days alone, hiking, reading, and just breathing air that didn't smell like exhaust. The cabin itself was small but sturdy, a classic wooden structure with a slanted roof and a stone chimney. From the photos online, it looked cozy, the kind of place where you could curl up with a blanket and a book and forget the world outside. The drive there had been long but not unpleasant. The first hour was on the highway, easy and smooth, with other cars passing by. Then, I turned onto a winding road that shrank into a gravel path, trees leaning over it so heavily in some spots that it felt like driving through a tunnel of branches. The air had already started to change by then, fresher, sharper, scented with pine and wet earth. By the time I reached the small clearing where the cabin stood, the sun was dipping below the treetops, casting long, slanted shadows across the ground. The cabin looked exactly as it did in the pictures. A small porch ran along the front, with a single rocking chair that had faded to gray from the sun. I parked and stepped out, letting the quiet sink into me. It was heavier than I expected. Not the kind of quiet you get when you close a door in the city, but the kind that presses in on you, fills every space, and makes even the smallest sounds, like the snap of a twig underfoot, startle you. I tried not to notice it. I wanted to enjoy the solitude. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood and old furniture, faintly musty but not unpleasant. The main room was simple. A small kitchen area to the left, a table with 2 chairs in the center, and a wood-burning stove against the far wall. The bedroom was off to the side, a single bed with a thick quilt folded neatly at the foot. I set down my bag, unlocked the windows, and took a deep breath. I had everything I needed: a flashlight, my backpack with food and water, a small camping stove, and a stack of books. I decided to go for a short walk before it got too dark. The woods were alive with noise. Birds calling from hidden branches, the wind whispering through the leaves, and something else I couldn't identify at first. A low, grating sound that seemed almost human but not quite. I stopped and listened. Nothing repeated, and I tried to convince myself it was probably just a deer or a raccoon moving through the underbrush. I kept walking, sticking to the narrow trail I had seen on the map, but every few minutes I felt the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. The forest was beautiful, but it felt like it was watching me. When I returned to the cabin, the sun had gone completely, leaving the woods in a deep, almost tangible darkness. I started a fire in the stove, the logs cracking and popping as they caught. The warmth was comforting, and I sat in the rocking chair, reading for a while, letting the firelight flicker across the walls. The grating noise from before came again, further away this time. I told myself it didn't matter. I was safe here, but then something caught my eye out the window. Movement just at the edge of the clearing. I froze. There was nothing to see clearly, just a shadow shifting between the trees. My first thought was an animal, maybe a deer. I tried to ignore it, but my eyes kept darting back. After a few minutes, the shadow moved again, closer this time. I realized the sound I had been hearing wasn't random. It was deliberate, something large moving slowly through the underbrush. My heart started to race, and I felt a cold sweat on the back of my neck. I considered leaving immediately, but the road back was more than an hour away, and it was completely dark now. The idea of hiking down that twisting gravel path alone made me hesitate. I decided to stay inside, lock the doors, and wait until morning. I checked the windows. All were closed and latched, and I even moved a chair in front of the door just in case. Hours passed. The fire burned low, casting shadows that danced against the walls. The noise outside never stopped. It came in fits and starts. Branches snapping, the grating sound again, heavier footsteps on the forest floor. I told myself it was probably just an animal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger, something with awareness, was circling the cabin. Every now and then, a shadow would flash past the window, and I would jump, gripping the edge of the table. Around midnight, it happened. A loud, deliberate thump on the side of the cabin. Not a branch falling, not the wind. Someone or something was hitting the cabin. I froze, listening. Then another thump, closer, like they were moving along the walls. My first instinct was to call 911, but the signal was non-existent out here. My second instinct was to run, but running into the dark forest alone felt more dangerous. I stayed where I was, trying to control my breathing, trying to make sense of what was happening. The thumping continued, slow and methodical. I could hear my own heart pounding in my ears. I grabbed the flashlight and slowly made my way to the bedroom, keeping as far from the windows as possible. I didn't want to look, but I needed to see if the door was secure. I pushed the chair further against it, leaning my weight on it, and then backed into the corner of the room. The noise seemed to stop then, as if whoever or whatever was outside was waiting. Time became impossible to measure. Minutes stretched into hours. Every little sound made me jump. At some point, I must have dozed, because I woke to a faint scratching at the window. My stomach dropped. Someone was trying to get in. I realized then that the cabin's locks and my chair were probably not enough. I needed a plan. I remembered the fireplace. The stove had some heavy iron tools nearby. I grabbed the poker and a small hatchet that was hanging on the wall, just in case. Then I moved all the chairs and anything heavy I could find in front of the door and windows. The scratching intensified, more insistent. Whoever it was had realized the cabin wasn't open. I stayed quiet, listening, waiting for a moment to escape if needed. Eventually, the scratching stopped, Complete silence fell, except for the occasional pop from the dying fire. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, gripping the poker and listening. At first light, I ventured outside carefully, staying close to the cabin. The clearing was empty. Nothing moved. The only trace of what had happened was deep footprints in the soft soil, circling the cabin, large and uneven. Whoever it was hadn't left in a straight line. They had lurked, watched, and finally disappeared when they realized I wasn't vulnerable. I packed my things as quickly as I could, leaving no trace of my presence, and drove down the gravel road without looking back. The quiet of the forest during the day felt normal again, but I couldn't shake the memory of the night. Once I reached the highway, I called the local authorities to report it. They told me that sometimes people use abandoned cabins in the woods to hide or stalk, and warned me never to stay alone in an isolated area without checking it out in advance. I never went back. The cabin itself was fine structurally. Nothing had been broken, but the experience had left its mark. The forest could feel like a sanctuary during the day and a trap at night. I realized that solitude in the wild comes with risks that are real, tangible, and sometimes more frightening than any ghost story. From that experience, I learned to respect the isolation, to never take it for granted, and to always have an escape plan. I still hike and camp, but now I do it with awareness, with preparation, and never completely alone in a place where someone or something could watch and wait. The fear I felt in that cabin wasn't built by imagination. It was built by reality, by the unknown presence that had lingered just out of reach, and by the understanding that in the woods, human control is always limited. I had planned this trip for months. The cabin was tucked deep into the northern woods, far from any roads that could be driven on without a four-wheel drive vehicle. The satellite map looked promising, and the reviews online were few but positive. I wanted a break from everything: work, people, emails, phones. Just a week with no one, no noise, and no distractions. I left on a Thursday morning, carrying a backpack filled with food, water, firewood, a first aid kit, and all the basic survival gear I thought I would need. The drive itself had been long and tiring. At first, the roads were paved and familiar, lined with small shops and houses, then slowly became narrow gravel paths surrounded by thick trees. Eventually, I was driving on nothing more than a dirt track, ruts deep from previous vehicles, and pine needles scattered everywhere. The air smelled different here, cooler, fresher, but with a weight to it, like the forest was holding its breath. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was already low, spilling golden light across the treetops. The cabin looked smaller than I expected. One story, log walls darkened with age, a single chimney. A stack of firewood leaned against the side, and the front porch sagged a little, worn by years of weather. There were no cars, no people, no footprints in the dirt around the cabin. Just silence, except for the distant calls of birds and the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. I parked the car, locked it, and carried my bags to the cabin. The door creaked when I pushed it open, and a faint smell of dust and old wood hit me. The inside was simple: a small living room, a tiny kitchen corner, a single bedroom, and a bathroom. Everything looked intact but unused, like the cabin had been abandoned for weeks but maintained enough to avoid complete decay. I set my backpack down, checked the windows, and noted how isolated everything was. The nearest road I could see from the cabin was at least a mile away, hidden behind the dense trees. I unpacked slowly, trying to ignore the rising sense of unease that came with being alone in such a remote place. The sun was disappearing fast, and I started a small fire in the fireplace. Flames licked the logs, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. I ate a simple meal, organized my gear, and then sat by the fire watching the shadows. At some point, I realized the forest outside was growing darker, the shapes of the trees merging into one massive wall of blackness. The first night passed without incident, but sleep came fitfully. Every creak of the cabin, every groan of the trees in the wind, made me jump. I told myself it was just the building settling, just the forest being alive. Around 2 a.m., I woke to a noise. It was subtle, almost inaudible, a faint scraping outside one of the windows near the corner of the cabin. I froze, straining to hear. Silence followed for a long moment. Then the scraping again, slightly louder, closer to the door. My heart hammered. I reminded myself that it was probably a deer or some other animal, maybe a raccoon, but deep down, I knew the sound was too deliberate, too steady to be random wildlife. I stayed in bed, listening, trying to rationalize. When the noise stopped, I finally drifted back to sleep, only to be awakened again by something heavier. Footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate. Pause. Slow again. I couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. They lasted maybe 5 minutes, then stopped. I waited, tense, until daylight. By then, the unease had settled into a dull, persistent fear. In the morning, I explored the cabin thoroughly, checking all doors and windows. Everything was locked. Nothing seemed broken. No signs of entry, no footprints in the dirt, no disturbances in the surrounding forest. I tried to convince myself that it had been an animal, but part of me refused to believe it. The silence outside was too heavy, the air too still, as if the forest itself was watching me. The next few days were a mix of routine and constant alertness. I chopped firewood, gathered water from a nearby stream, and kept the cabin clean. At night, I always slept lightly, leaving the flashlight and a small hatchet on the bedside table. Sometimes I thought I heard things outside. A snap of a branch, a brush against the cabin walls, faint scraping sounds that stopped when I tried to pinpoint them. Each time, I reminded myself that I was in the woods and wild animals were everywhere. Rationality kept me from panicking, but only just. On the fourth night, the noises escalated. It began with footsteps around the cabin at first, pacing slowly, then a louder thud against one of the windows. My stomach turned. I grabbed the flashlight and hatchet and crept to the door, shining the beam outside. Nothing, not even footprints in the dirt. I circled the cabin, checking for any signs of entry, but found nothing. That's when I noticed something odd. The firewood I had stacked neatly was scattered. Some logs moved from their original piles. My pulse quickened. I hadn't seen anyone, hadn't left the cabin for hours. Something had been inside my perimeter. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the corner of the cabin, hatchet ready, flashlight sweeping constantly. I didn't sleep. I didn't want to. At some point, I realized the fear wasn't just about someone being here. It was about being completely unprepared. No one could hear me if I screamed. No help would come. I was truly alone. The next day, I resolved to investigate the surrounding area. I packed a small bag with essentials, grabbed the hatchet and a heavy branch, and walked carefully through the forest. I circled the cabin, checking for footprints, for disturbed underbrush, for any sign of human presence. The woods were dense, full of shadows. After hours, I found what I was looking for, or what I feared finding. Faint boot prints in the mud leading toward the cabin and back into the woods. They were small, deliberate, and definitely not mine. Someone had been watching, following, circling. I felt a rush of cold panic, but forced myself to note the details, to remember the direction of the prints. That night, the presence outside became undeniable. I could hear someone moving around the cabin constantly, whispering sometimes, though I couldn't make out words. It was impossible to sleep. I sat by the fireplace, torch in hand, flashlight scanning outside, waiting for dawn. The feeling of being hunted, observed, threatened, was oppressive. I realized then that this wasn't just fear. It was a precise, calculated tension that wore on you until your mind felt raw. By the 6th day, I had devised a plan. I couldn't stay another night, couldn't wait for the person outside to make a move. I packed my bag quietly at first light, leaving only the essentials, and prepared to leave. I would take the longest route back, through the forest and down to a secondary road, avoiding the main dirt path in case someone had been watching it. I left the cabin as silently as I could, moving cautiously, scanning constantly for signs of anyone nearby. As I walked, I noticed more signs. Broken branches, footprints, impressions in the mud that weren't there before. Whoever had been circling the cabin had followed me, or at least tried to track me. The fear was absolute now. I moved faster, but silently, trying not to make noise, staying low behind bushes and trees. Hours passed, and finally, I glimpsed a faint ribbon of pavement ahead, the secondary road. Relief surged. I made it there, hurrying to the nearest gas station, a small, lonely building with a clerk inside. I told them my story, asked them to call the local authorities. When the police arrived and investigated, they found nothing in or around the cabin. No footprints, no evidence. The cabin itself was undisturbed. My suspicion was that whoever had been circling the cabin had retreated when I left. They had been cautious, calculated, never leaving enough evidence to trace. The authorities said it could have been a drifter, someone using abandoned cabins as temporary shelter. No one was arrested. No one was found. Even after I returned home, the memory haunted me. Every small sound at night, every creak of a floorboard, set my nerves on edge. I learned that wilderness isolation is both liberating and terrifying. It gives you a peace you cannot find anywhere else, but it also exposes you to the raw, unfiltered reality of how vulnerable you truly are. I never returned to that cabin, and I never took another trip into the deep woods alone. Couldn't risk it, but I also couldn't stop thinking about the precision of whoever had been watching, and the simple fact that, if I hadn't left when I did, I might not have made it out at all. I still dream about that cabin, the first night, the shadows dancing on the walls, the slow, deliberate scraping at the windows. It's a reminder that isolation isn't always peaceful, and the forest isn't always empty. And sometimes the scariest thing isn't a ghost, or a wild animal, or a storm. It's another human being, silent, patient, watching you when you think you're truly alone. I had been planning this solo cabin trip for months. I wanted a place far from people, far from roads, far from the constant noise of the city. I found a small cabin listed on a rental site. It was old but solid, tucked away in a dense forest, surrounded by tall pines and rough hills. The owner's pictures made it look peaceful, almost too peaceful, which is exactly why I wanted it. My car was loaded with supplies, food for a week, bottled water, a small first aid kit, batteries, a lantern, my hiking gear, a sleeping bag, and some basic tools. I left late on a Friday afternoon, knowing it would take me hours to reach it. The GPS on my phone led me down winding, narrow roads that became dirt tracks as I approached my destination. First, it was calm. Birds chirped, and the wind whispered through the trees. I felt a strange sort of relief with every mile that took me away from the city. By the time I arrived, the sun was low. The cabin looked even smaller and lonelier in the fading light. The wooden planks of the walls were weathered and gray, some warped slightly from age. There was no electricity, which I knew beforehand, but the place had a small solar panel on the roof and a wood stove inside. A thin trail of smoke still lingered in the air from someone who had been there recently, maybe days ago. The smell of pine and damp earth mixed with the faint smoke. It had an oddly comforting smell, like the forest itself had been waiting for someone to come and disturb its silence. I unloaded my car slowly, taking care to organize everything inside. The cabin was small. There was one main room with a wooden table, a few chairs, a small couch, and a tiny kitchen area with a sink, a stove, and some shelves. A narrow staircase led up to a loft where a mattress sat. I unpacked what I would need first, stacked the food in the shelves, and checked the stove. Outside, the forest stretched on for hundreds of yards in every direction. There were no other houses, no power lines, nothing to indicate civilization. Only trees, rocks, and the occasional rustle of small animals. The first night was quiet, though I remember it being unsettling in a way I could not fully explain. Every small sound seemed magnified. The creaking of the wood, the wind brushing against the walls, the distant snap of a branch. I made a small fire in the stove and cooked a simple dinner. As I ate, I kept looking out the windows at the forest. My mind felt strangely alert. I thought about all the movies and stories about people disappearing in the woods, and I reminded myself that this was reality. There were no monsters here, only nature. Still, I could not ignore the feeling that I was being watched, though logically, I knew it was impossible. The forest had been here long before me and would remain long after. I went to sleep in the loft, lying on the mattress and listening to the wind. Sleep came in fits and starts. Every so often, I woke to small noises outside. Something moving, perhaps an animal, or maybe just branches brushing against each other. I tried to ignore it, but my heart was racing. By the time morning came, I was exhausted. I decided to explore the area. There was a small stream not far from the cabin, and I followed it upstream for a few hours. The water was clear, the stones slippery underfoot. I saw deer tracks, rabbit burrows, and signs of other wildlife, but nothing dangerous. Still, I noticed how isolated the place was. Even when I shouted, my voice did not carry. There were no echoes, no response, only silence. Returning to the cabin, I spent the afternoon cleaning and organizing. I made a fire again and set up some kind of routine, check the firewood, cook meals, keep an eye on the weather. I had brought books and a journal, but my attention kept being pulled outside. I walked around the cabin perimeter, looking for any signs of people, any tracks, anything that would indicate I wasn't alone. I found nothing except a few footprints that looked like they belonged to a deer or perhaps a stray dog. The second night was when things started feeling different. I had heard a noise outside around midnight, a faint crunching as if someone were walking just beyond the treeline. I told myself it was an animal, but the sound repeated, slow steps, pacing around the cabin. My heart was beating fast. I checked the doors and windows. Everything was locked, everything was secure. The cabin was solid. Still, I could not shake the feeling that something human was out there. I stayed awake for hours, clutching a small knife I had brought. The steps outside continued sporadically, always just far enough that I could not see anything through the darkness, yet close enough that it felt threatening. I imagined someone could be watching, waiting for me to lower my guard. I thought about the nearest road, which was miles away. Even if someone was outside, they could not get me easily. But still, fear settled in my chest like a heavy stone. Morning brought relief. I forced myself to ignore the night and focus on the day. I collected water from the stream, carried firewood, and started preparing for longer hikes. I wanted to explore further from the cabin, but a small voice in the back of my mind kept warning me to stay close. The third night, things escalated. Around 11 p.m., I heard the steps again, slower this time. They circled the cabin, paused, then moved away, then back. The sound of a branch snapping under weight sounded only a few feet away from the window. I froze, listening. The wind was still, the forest quiet, and yet the steps were deliberate, cautious. Not an animal, I realized. Person. Someone was out there. I thought about my options. I had a knife, a hatchet, some tools, but I had no way to call for help. My phone barely had service, and even if it did, the nearest town was miles away. Panic started to rise, but I forced myself to breathe. I decided to do what made the most sense. Stay calm, stay quiet, and make sure the cabin was secure. I checked the locks again, put a chair against the door, and positioned myself near a window where I could see outside. Hours passed. I did not sleep. I heard the steps once, twice, then silence. The sun eventually began to rise, and the forest returned to its usual sounds. Birds, wind, rustling leaves. I had survived the night, but I felt drained, mentally and physically. Over the next day, I tried to rationalize the events. Perhaps someone had been hiking nearby and spotted the cabin. Maybe they were curious or lost. I kept a close eye on the perimeter, marking areas where footprints might appear. But I saw nothing unusual. Still, my nerves were raw. Every small sound made me jump. I slept with my clothes on and kept the knife next to me. By the fourth night, I had a plan. If anyone came close again, I would make my presence known, but on my own terms. I collected rocks, set up noise traps with sticks against the cabin walls, and made sure every exit was secure. I also moved heavier furniture in front of the doors, just in case. The night was long, but this time I felt slightly more in control. I knew I had prepared for whatever could happen. On the fifth day, I decided I could not stay longer. I packed my things quickly, organized my supplies, and prepared the cabin for my departure. I left a note for the owner, explaining that the cabin was great, but I had felt unsafe. I locked the doors, checked all windows, and walked to my car. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror at the trees. The cabin disappeared behind a curve, then a hill, then the dense forest swallowed it. I felt relief wash over me, a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude. I had survived the nights of fear, and I had learned that even in the quietest, most isolated places, humans are never truly alone. Other people can wander into your space, and the forest, no matter how peaceful, can amplify the smallest threat until it feels enormous. Back in the city, I unpacked slowly. I kept the memories of the forest vivid in my mind. The smell of pine, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the quiet that could suddenly turn threatening. I started to appreciate human presence in a way I hadn't before. I realized that fear is not just about danger, but about the unknown. And in that small cabin, isolated in the middle of a forest, I had faced the unknown and survived. The story of those nights stayed with me. I never returned to that cabin. I told myself that I would not let fear of the unknown dictate my life, but I also knew I would not underestimate it again. Life in the wilderness requires preparation, awareness, and respect for the realities of isolation. I learned how fragile comfort can be when you are alone, how quickly a safe space can feel unsafe, and how small precautions can make the difference between panic and control. Even years later, I could recall every detail. The creak of the wooden stairs, the smell of damp earth mixed with smoke, the shadows that moved in the forest, the steps outside the window. It had been terrifying at times, but I had emerged from the experience stronger, more aware, and with a clearer understanding of the boundary between solitude and vulnerability. The forest had not hurt me, but it had tested me, and I had passed the test. The cabin, quiet and weathered, remained in my memory as a place where fear and clarity intertwined, teaching lessons I would never forget. I had planned the trip for months. The cabin was miles from the nearest town, hidden deep in the forest, far from any roads or neighbors. I wanted solitude, a chance to disconnect from everything: work, people, noise. I imagined myself waking up to the sound of wind through the trees, making a fire in the stone fireplace, reading books in the quiet. It all seemed simple when I booked it online and loaded my car with supplies: canned food, bottled water, a sleeping bag, extra blankets, a first aid kit, and a small gas stove. I had my hiking boots, a flashlight, spare batteries, a map of the area, and a compass, even though I had GPS on my phone. I didn't like depending entirely on electronics. I told myself it was preparation, but looking back, I think it was a premonition I didn't understand yet. The drive itself was long. The first hour was paved road, then gravel, then narrow dirt paths that twisted through the forest. The trees grew close to the road, so close that I had to slow down to avoid brushing branches along the sides of the car. There were no other vehicles. Occasionally, I saw signs of wildlife: tracks crossing the dirt road, the bones of a small animal on the side of the path, first stuck to a branch as if some predator had brushed past. I remember feeling a small thrill of unease, but I ignored it, telling myself it was part of being out in the wilderness. By the time I reached the final turn, a small sign marked cabin. I was tired and eager to reach the place. The cabin was small but solid. Built from logs with a pitched roof and a stone chimney, it looked exactly like the pictures online. There was a small porch with a broken railing, and the windows were dusty, showing little of the interior. The door had a key in a lockbox outside, which I had been given instructions to open. Clicked smoothly as I turned it, and I pushed the door open. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood and something faintly metallic, like rust or old water. The floorboards creaked under my feet as I stepped inside. The cabin was sparsely furnished. There was a kitchen corner with a small counter and cabinets, a wood-burning stove, a table, and 2 chairs. A small living area had a worn couch, a coffee table, and a few books scattered on the floor. The bedroom was just a loft above, accessible by a narrow ladder. It had a mattress, blankets, and a pillow. The bathroom was tiny but functional. Everything was simple, utilitarian. Nothing fancy, but everything seemed to work. I spent the first few hours unpacking and organizing. I stored my food in a cabinet, filled water containers from a tap outside, and stacked firewood near the fireplace. The sun was already low by the time I finished. I decided to make a fire. The fireplace was stone, the logs dry. I struck a match and the fire caught quickly. The smell of burning wood filled the cabin. I sat on the couch, drinking water, watching the flames. Outside, the forest was darkening. Shadows crept between the trees. I could hear the wind moving branches and leaves, a sound I had always loved. It was peaceful, and I felt a sense of satisfaction, having made it here safely. Night fell completely. I had brought a flashlight, but I wanted to experience darkness, the kind that wraps everything in silence. The wind picked up. The trees groaned and scraped against each other. Somewhere in the distance, I heard the faint howl of an animal, probably a coyote. The sound was low, eerie, but distant enough not to feel threatening. I went to the loft to sleep. The mattress was thin, but with the blankets, it was comfortable enough. I thought I would fall asleep immediately, but I lay awake longer than I expected, listening. The cabin settled with creaks and pops, wood contracting in the cool night. I told myself it was normal. Still, I noticed how dark it was, how the shadows seemed to move if I let my eyes wander. I turned on my flashlight for a moment, shone it across the room, and saw nothing unusual. I lay back down and eventually fell asleep. I woke early, startled, to the sound of something heavy outside the cabin. It was different from the wind or branches falling. It was deliberate, a thump, followed by another. I froze. My heart raced. I strained my ears. Another thump, closer this time, coming from the front of the cabin. I stayed still, unsure of what to do. I didn't have a weapon, not really, just the small flashlight I kept near the bed. The thumping stopped, and then I heard scraping, like claws or something rough being dragged across wood or stone. I didn't move. My mind raced with possibilities, all terrifying. Eventually, the sound stopped completely. I waited, listening to my own breathing. After 10 minutes, I forced myself to look out the window. The forest was empty. The morning light showed only trees, shadows, and fallen leaves. I told myself it was an animal, probably a deer or a raccoon, but the sound didn't match any deer I had ever heard. It had been too heavy, too deliberate. Still, there was no trace outside. I decided to stay calm. I made coffee, sat by the fire, and tried to convince myself I had imagined it. I did my best to ignore the unease that settled in my stomach. By late morning, I decided to explore the surrounding area. I grabbed my backpack, packed water, some snacks, and my compass. I left the cabin and walked along a faint trail leading into the forest. The trees were dense, the underbrush thick. It was beautiful in a wild, untamed way. I tried to enjoy it, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I heard a snap of a twig, I spun my head, searching, but saw nothing. Hours passed. I didn't find much, only deeper woods and the occasional sign of wildlife. Broken branches, animal tracks, a bird startled into flight. When I returned to the cabin, I felt relief. Nothing had followed me. I told myself I had been paranoid. That night, I slept with the flashlight in my hand. The noises came again. This time, I heard footsteps circling the cabin, slow, deliberate, crunching leaves. I could swear I heard breathing, shallow, uneven, moving from one side of the cabin to the other. I held my flashlight, my hand shaking. I debated leaving immediately, but I didn't know if I could get the car started in the dark, down the narrow dirt road, or even navigate the forest without the sun. Hours passed. I eventually dozed in short bursts, waking every time a sound came near. By dawn, I was exhausted, pale, and trembling. The first thing I did was check the perimeter. Nothing. No footprints, no disturbed leaves. It was as if whoever or whatever had been there had melted into the forest. I couldn't make sense of it. I told myself I had to stay rational. I spent the next day reinforcing the cabin. I checked the locks, piled extra firewood near the door, made sure my phone was fully charged, and mapped out the area around the cabin. I even considered leaving, but the road was too narrow and winding to risk it in one attempt. I stayed, trying to convince myself it was safer to remain in a known place than risk getting lost or stranded in the forest. I kept a low profile, moving quietly, listening constantly. That night, the noises were back. Louder, closer. Something tried the door. I could hear the handle rattling, the wood groaning under force. I had no choice but to confront it in some way. I grabbed a heavy log from the fireplace and held it near the door. The rattling continued, then stopped abruptly. Hours passed. By morning, I was nearly delirious with fatigue. The next day, I knew I couldn't stay passive. I decided to observe from the cabin without venturing too far. I took out binoculars, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. I watched for hours, the sun climbing, shadows shifting, birds flying. Then I saw it. A figure, crouched near a tree, observing the cabin. It wasn't an animal. The way it moved, slow, careful, deliberate, made me realize I wasn't alone. I locked the door, gathered supplies, and prepared to leave. I had a plan. I would wait for the figure to leave, then make a dash to the car and out of the forest. I packed everything essential, leaving non-critical items behind. I kept my phone and flashlight ready. Time stretched, each sound amplified in the quiet. Eventually, the figure moved back into the trees. I didn't wait to see where it went. I ran. The path to the car was longer than I remembered. I stumbled over roots and rocks, my heart hammering in my chest. The forest seemed endless, the shadows deep, hiding things that could jump out at any moment. I finally reached the car, breathless, trembling, and fumbled for the keys. The engine roared to life. I didn't look back. I drove through the dirt road, the gravel, the curves, barely slowing for turns. By the time I reached paved roads, I could feel the tension leaving me slowly. I had survived. Nothing followed me onto the main road. I was exhausted but safe. When I finally returned to civilization, I found a police station and reported what had happened. They listened, asked questions, but without evidence, there was nothing they could do. I told myself I had escaped a dangerous intruder. The experience stayed with me, not as a story of the supernatural, but as a stark reminder of how vulnerable a person can be in isolation. I never went back to that cabin. I never took another trip that isolated. I learned to respect the silence of the forest, to understand that sometimes the scariest things are not imagined. They are real, deliberate, and patient. They wait and they watch, and survival can come down to nothing more than timing, observation, and the willingness to act when every instinct tells you to freeze. I had been planning the trip for months. The cabin was far away from the nearest town, a small, isolated place tucked deep in the forest. I wanted to get away from everything: work, the city, the constant noise and pressure, and I thought a week alone in the woods would be perfect. The directions to the cabin were written on a small piece of paper my friend had given me, a rough map with arrows pointing along a dirt road that eventually turned into a narrow trail. The last part of the path was barely wide enough for a single car, and the trees hung so low over the road that my headlights barely penetrated the darkness. The drive had been long, bumpy, and nerve-wracking, but when I finally saw the cabin through the trees, a wooden structure that looked older than anything I had ever lived in, I felt a strange sense of relief mixed with unease. The cabin was small, with faded brown wood and a tin roof. The windows were dusty, and the door creaked loudly when I opened it. Inside, it smelled of damp wood and old smoke, like someone had lived here years ago and then left it empty. The furniture was sparse but functional. A small kitchen table, 2 chairs, a sofa that sagged in the middle, and a bed with a thin mattress. I placed my backpack on the floor and looked around. There was a fireplace with some old logs, a small stove, and a pile of kindling stacked in the corner. I checked the water supply. There was a sink connected to a pipe, and the faucet dripped slowly. It wasn't much, but it was enough for a week if I was careful. The first night, I lit the fire in the fireplace. The flames crackled, casting long shadows across the walls. Outside, the forest was dark and silent, except for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of an owl. I felt a little uneasy at first, but the warmth from the fire and the soft orange glow gave me a sense of comfort. I slept in the bed that night, and though I woke a few times to the sounds outside, nothing happened, and the morning came peacefully. The next day, I explored the area around the cabin. The trees were thick, the undergrowth tangled, and the ground soft with moss and fallen leaves. I noticed old tire tracks that might have been from someone visiting long ago, but no signs of people recently. I walked a few hundred meters down a small trail, reaching a creek. The water was clear and cold, running over smooth stones. I filled my water bottle, careful not to drink directly from the creek without filtering. There were birds I didn't recognize, squirrels and small animals darting through the underbrush, and a sense of isolation that was both thrilling and unsettling. I knew I was alone, completely alone, and part of me loved it, while another part felt anxious, like I was being watched by the forest itself. That night, I made a bigger fire and cooked some canned food I had brought along. I stayed near the fire, listening to the sounds outside. The wind shifted, and the trees groaned. Something heavy fell somewhere in the distance, a sound like a branch snapping under a large weight. My heart jumped, but I reminded myself it was probably a deer or a fallen tree limb. I couldn't stop thinking, though, about how isolated I was. My phone had no signal, so there was no way to call anyone if something went wrong. The idea of being trapped here, alone, with only my wits and supplies, made me tense. By the third day, I was used to the routine. I chopped wood for the fireplace, fetched water from the creek, and explored the nearby trails. I found an old hunting stand half hidden in the trees and a few rusted tools scattered near the cabin. Everything seemed abandoned, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the area had been used recently. Tracks in the mud suggested small animals, but some footprints looked like they might have been human. Boots, maybe a size larger than mine, but old and weathered. I brushed them off, thinking I was imagining things. Then, on the fourth day, the first real sign of danger came. I was outside, splitting wood near the edge of the forest, when I heard a snapping sound behind me. I froze, turning slowly. There was nothing at first, just the wind through the trees. Then, a shape moved quickly between the trees, something large and fast. It didn't stop or look at me, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. My first thought was a bear, and I realized how unprepared I was. I had no bear spray, no gun, nothing but a small hatchet in my hand. My stomach sank. I spent the rest of the day inside the cabin, checking the locks and the windows, trying to convince myself it was just a deer or some other animal. But the sense of being watched lingered. That night, I slept fitfully. Every creak, snap, or rustle outside felt amplified. Around midnight, I woke to a sound at the door. A light tapping, soft but deliberate. My heart raced. I sat up, staring at the door. The fire had burned low, and the cabin was dim except for the faint moonlight through the windows. I waited, listening, but the sound stopped. I convinced myself it was probably a branch falling against the cabin, but I couldn't shake the unease. I stayed awake for hours, listening, imagining shapes in the shadows. The next morning, I decided to be more cautious. I didn't go far from the cabin, keeping my eyes on the trees. I reinforced the door with a wooden beam I found lying around, even though it was heavy and awkward. I checked the windows and made sure nothing could easily break in. I even cleared some of the undergrowth near the cabin so I could see approaching movement more easily. It made me feel slightly better, but the unease didn't go away. On the fifth day, the situation escalated. I was gathering firewood when I noticed fresh tracks near the cabin. They weren't animal tracks, they were boot prints, deep and deliberate. They led around the cabin in a circle, and I realized someone had been watching me, maybe even last night. Panic set in. I checked every corner of the cabin, searching for hidden doors or signs that someone had broken in, but I found nothing. My mind raced. If someone was out there, who were they? Were they dangerous? How long had they been watching me? I felt trapped. I thought about leaving, but the road was long and rough, and I had no cell signal. The thought of walking miles through the forest, possibly with someone following me, made my stomach churn. That night, I stayed awake again. I kept the fire going, listening intently. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it. The crunch of footsteps on the dirt outside, slow and careful, moving along the perimeter of the cabin. I grabbed my hatchet and waited, crouched near the window. The sounds continued for what felt like hours. My mind tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone had lost their way, maybe it was a hunter, but the deliberate pacing, the silence between steps, felt deliberate, purposeful. I couldn't tell if they knew I was awake, or if they were just circling, waiting. By dawn, the footsteps stopped. The next day, I made a plan. I couldn't stay here another night knowing someone might be outside, watching, waiting. I packed my supplies, loaded my backpack, and planned to leave early. I would wait for daylight to make my way down the trail, staying as quiet and low profile as possible. I checked the door one last time, reinforced it again, and stepped outside. The forest was calm, almost eerily still. I followed the trail slowly, listening carefully. The boot prints from the previous day were still visible, and I tried to stay on the edges, using the trees as cover. Hours passed. The trail twisted, climbed, and descended. I moved carefully, every step deliberate. I didn't hear anything unusual until late afternoon. Then, suddenly, a movement caught my eye. A figure, tall and wearing dark clothing, moving between the trees. My heart jumped. I crouched low, hiding behind a fallen log, and waited. The figure paused, looking in my direction, then disappeared into the forest. I realized they had been following me, probably tracking me from the cabin. I felt my pulse quicken. I had no choice but to keep moving, faster now, trying to put distance between myself and whoever, or whatever, was following me. By evening, I saw the outline of the dirt road. Relief washed over me, but I didn't stop. I moved quickly, scanning the trees for any sign of pursuit. Once I reached the road, I began walking along it, hoping to find a car or a house. I kept to the edge, crouching low when I heard distant sounds, but after an hour, nothing followed. The forest seemed empty, and I realized I had escaped without confrontation. My legs ached. My body was covered in scratches and dirt, but I felt alive, triumphant. Eventually, I reached a small highway where I finally got cell service. I called the local police and reported the cabin, the tracks, and the presence of someone who might have been watching me. They said they would investigate. I found a small motel nearby and spent the night there, finally able to rest without fear of being watched. The next day, I returned to the cabin with a friend who lived nearby and some proper equipment. We inspected the area. The boot prints were still visible around the cabin, fresh and deep. We found broken branches and subtle signs that someone had been hiding nearby for several days. It was clear that I had narrowly avoided a serious confrontation. The police later confirmed that the area had been used by a trespasser who had been living in the woods illegally. They hadn't found him yet, but at least the risk was no longer unknown. The experience stayed with me. I realized that the isolation I had sought came with dangers I hadn't considered. The forest was beautiful, peaceful, and quiet, but it could also hide threats, human and animal alike. I learned to respect that, to be prepared, and to understand that being alone didn't mean being safe. But despite the fear, I didn't regret going. I survived, and I learned how to navigate both the wilderness and the unpredictability of people. The cabin remained, silent and empty, a reminder that solitude can be both a gift and a test, and that preparation and caution are the only things that make survival possible. In the weeks after, I started planning trips with more care. I carried tools, maps, and communication devices. I studied the area I intended to visit, and though the memory of the forest and the unknown watcher haunted me, I could look back on the experience with clarity. I had survived fear, isolation, and the very real danger of someone stalking me, and I had come out stronger, more alert, and more aware of the fragile balance between human curiosity and the unpredictability of the natural world. I never thought that a simple weekend getaway could turn into something that would keep me awake at night for weeks afterward. I had been looking forward to it for months. A small, rustic cabin tucked far back in the woods, away from anyone, anything, and everything that made life loud and complicated. I told myself I needed it, that I just needed to disappear for a little while, recharge, and be alone with nature. I didn't expect that the cabin would end up feeling less like a refuge and more like a trap. I arrived late in the afternoon. The road leading to the cabin was a narrow dirt track, uneven and full of dips, with overgrown branches scratching at my car as if the forest itself were trying to warn me off. I remember thinking how quiet it was. Too quiet. Even the birds seemed sparse, only the occasional caw of a crow breaking the stillness. The GPS signal had gone out miles back, which I didn't mind at first, seeing it as a chance to really disconnect. When I finally saw the cabin, it looked exactly like the photos online. Small, weathered, surrounded by towering pines, with a stone chimney and a deck that overlooked a creek. There was a thin trail leading from the road that had obviously been used by previous visitors, though it was narrow and not very well trodden. I parked the car and unloaded my gear, noting how isolated I truly was. There was no other structure in sight, and I felt a mix of relief and an edge of unease. The cabin door creaked in the wind as I opened it, and the smell of damp wood and old pine hit me immediately. Inside, the cabin was simple but functional. A small kitchen with an old stove, a tiny living area with a sagging couch, a fireplace, and 2 bedrooms. The furniture was rustic, worn, and uninviting, but clean enough. I had intentionally picked this cabin because it promised solitude, and as I dropped my bags on the floor, I felt a strange thrill of freedom. No cell service, no one to bother me, no obligations. The first night passed without incident. I had brought a small lantern and a stack of books, and I remember sitting by the fireplace, reading until the flames died down. The darkness outside was thick, absolute. No moon, no streetlights, just the faint rustle of leaves, the sound of the creek trickling in the distance. At some point, I drifted to sleep on the couch, lulled by the combination of warmth and isolation. I woke in the middle of the night, my senses heightened, something I couldn't quite place making my stomach tighten. The cabin was completely dark, except for the faint glow of the fire embers. I heard something, a snapping of a branch outside, far enough away that it could have been an animal, but sharp enough that my body reacted. My heart rate sped up, and I strained my ears, but I didn't hear it again. I shook it off, telling myself I was imagining things, that it was just the forest, but the unease lingered. The next morning, I explored the surrounding area. The cabin sat on the edge of a small clearing, and the creek ran a few dozen meters down a gentle slope. The woods were dense beyond that, the trees so thick that you could barely see more than 10 meters in. I walked along the creek, finding signs of wildlife, broken branches, footprints I couldn't identify, and the occasional bird. The isolation was exactly what I had wanted, but a small, nagging thought at the back of my mind kept repeating. I was completely alone out here, with no one within miles. For the next 2 days, I settled into a routine. I chopped firewood, explored the nearby trails, and cooked simple meals. Felt good to be disconnected. But with every passing hour, I noticed subtle things that chipped away at my sense of safety. Small noises at odd hours, thuds against the walls, the faint scraping of something heavy moving outside. But whenever I looked, nothing was there. The creek sounded different at night, louder, as if something had shifted upstream. I kept telling myself I was imagining it, that it was just the normal sounds of the forest amplified by silence. On the 3rd night, the sense of being watched became impossible to ignore. I had left the lantern off, wanting to sleep in complete darkness, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there, just beyond the trees. I tried to rationalize. Maybe it was an animal, a deer or a bear, but then I remembered the subtle scratches along the deck railing I hadn't noticed before, fresh-looking, like they had been made recently. My stomach churned, and I realized that no animal I knew moved with such deliberate persistence. I didn't sleep well. Every time I dozed, I woke with a start at some noise outside. A branch falling, the rustle of leaves, the creek gurgling unusually. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow move between the trees, just beyond the clearing, and it was large and upright. I froze, trying to convince myself I was hallucinating, but my adrenaline surged, and I stayed awake the rest of the night, every muscle tense. By morning, I knew I had to do something. I packed a small backpack with essentials: water, some food, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and went for a long walk down the main dirt track, hoping to see another road or some sign of civilization. The forest felt oppressive, even in daylight. Every sound made me jump. Broken branches, holes in the ground, disturbed undergrowth. I started noticing signs that someone had passed this way recently. Not tourists or hikers, but someone familiar with the forest, careful enough not to leave obvious traces. That afternoon, I returned to the cabin, exhausted and uneasy. I noticed the back door, which I had locked the first night, slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it, and my mind raced through possibilities. Maybe I had forgotten, maybe the wind had pushed it open, but it didn't make sense. The door was heavy, old, and not easily moved by a breeze. Panic started to rise, and I searched the cabin. Nothing appeared missing, nothing out of place besides the door. But the sense of intrusion was unmistakable. I felt a heavy weight pressing down on me, a suffocating awareness that I was being watched, followed, studied. That night, I stayed awake, flashlight in hand, watching the shadows move beyond the cabin walls. I couldn't see anything clearly, but every faint noise made me jump. The isolation was no longer peaceful, it was dangerous. I realized I couldn't rely on luck. I had to take action. At first light, I packed the car and made a careful scan of the surrounding forest. Nothing. The dirt track was empty, the trees motionless. I drove away slowly, constantly glancing in the rearview mirror. I didn't know if anyone had been following me or just watching from the woods, but I refused to risk staying 1 minute longer. I resolved to report it later if I could, but right now, escape was the only priority. As I drove back to the main road, I noticed tire tracks on the dirt path that weren't mine. They were fresh, heavy, made by someone who had followed me, or perhaps had been tracking me the whole time. The thought made my stomach drop. The isolation I had sought had turned into a nightmare. By the time I reached civilization, my nerves were shot, my body tense, my mind replaying every sound, every shadow, every scratch in the wood. The weeks afterward were not easy. I couldn't stop thinking about that cabin. The sense of being watched lingered, and I avoided hiking or forested areas for months. I realized how thin the line is between solitude and vulnerability. Nature is beautiful and peaceful, yes, but it can also feel like a trap if someone else with bad intentions knows it better than you do. I eventually told a friend about it, showing them the photos of the cabin, the exact location, and the path I had taken. They were shocked. Later, I learned that the area had been used by people who knew the forest very well. Hunters, perhaps, or others who stayed hidden for long stretches, moving silently, observing from a distance. No one ever confronted me directly. No one ever left a note. Nothing happened beyond the constant, invisible presence, but that was enough. The knowledge that someone had been there, unseen, while I thought I was alone, changed me. I no longer saw isolation as peaceful. I saw it as a risk. Now, years later, I still think about that cabin. I've returned to hiking and camping, but never in complete solitude, never in the deep woods with no way to call for help. I learned that the feeling of safety in isolation is fragile. It only takes a single moment, a door left ajar, a shadow in the trees, a sound out of place, to shatter it completely. And when that happens, there's no magic or luck to save you. You either react, you escape, or you become part of the forest yourself. I had planned this trip for months. The idea was simple: escape the city, the noise, the constant pressure of work, and just be alone in the wilderness for a week. I found a small cabin for rent online, nestled deep in the forest, far enough from any town or road to be truly isolated. The photos were charming, rustic, with a small porch overlooking a pond and trees that seemed to stretch forever. The description promised solitude, peace, and the kind of quiet you can only find far from civilization. I was craving that quiet. The drive to the cabin was long and winding. The asphalt eventually gave way to gravel, and then to a rough dirt road that twisted between hills covered in thick forest. The further I went, the more the trees pressed close on either side of the road, their branches brushing the roof of my car. The sun was just starting to dip below the horizon when I finally saw the cabin tucked among the trees. From the outside, it looked exactly like the pictures. Sturdy but weathered, surrounded by mossy stones and fallen leaves. A thin column of smoke rose lazily from the chimney, which made the cabin seem alive in a quiet, welcoming way. I unloaded my things and carried them inside. The cabin smelled faintly of pine and wood smoke. It was small, with a single bedroom, a living area, a kitchenette, and a bathroom. There was a fireplace stacked with logs and a small wood stove in the kitchen. A large window in the living area looked out over the pond, reflecting the dimming light of the evening. I felt a rare kind of calm, the tension I had carried for weeks slowly unwinding. After a simple dinner, I settled into the living room, sitting in an old armchair near the fireplace. The wood crackled as I lit a fire, and the room glowed warmly. Outside, the light had faded, and the forest became a mass of dark shapes. I tried to ignore the faint unease that came with the deepening darkness. I had been alone before, and I knew that darkness was just that. Darkness. Nothing more. I slept lightly that first night, waking occasionally to the sound of wind moving through the trees or the distant call of an owl. The isolation was peaceful in a strange, intense way. I was careful to lock the doors and windows before sleeping, and I checked my phone to make sure it had a signal. Weak, but enough for emergency calls if needed. The next day, I explored the area around the cabin. The forest was thick, with towering trees and undergrowth that crunched underfoot. The pond near the cabin was small but clear, with water so still it reflected the sky perfectly. I walked along its edge, noticing the small signs of wildlife. Bird tracks in the mud, the remnants of a squirrel's nest in a tree, the faint scent of animals that passed through the area overnight. There was something intimate about seeing the forest so untouched, so private. As the day wore on, I realized the forest was not just beautiful, it was confusing. The trees, while majestic, all looked the same. Paths twisted and turned in ways that made it easy to lose orientation. I marked my steps on the ground and tried to remember landmarks, but the deeper I went, the more I felt an almost claustrophobic sense of being watched. Not in a literal sense, not by anyone or anything, but by the environment itself. The forest was dense, old, and full of quiet life that didn't welcome intrusions. That night, the unease grew stronger. I had been outside earlier than sunset and didn't notice that the shadows had started to shift in odd ways, stretching longer and darker as night fell. The wind picked up, rustling through the branches with an almost deliberate persistence. My fire was small, barely enough to keep the darkness at bay in the corners of the room. I ate a simple meal, then moved closer to the fireplace, noticing that the shadows cast by the logs seemed to stretch unnaturally across the walls. I told myself I was imagining things. My mind was just tired from the drive and the long hours at work before I left. The rational part of me tried to dismiss the sudden creaking of the cabin floorboards, the sound of branches scratching against the roof, and the occasional thump outside, which I guessed was a deer or raccoon moving through the underbrush. But deep down, I felt a prickling tension, a sense that being this isolated made me vulnerable in a way I hadn't anticipated. The third day, I noticed that something had changed. The feeling of isolation was no longer comfortable, it was oppressive. The forest seemed denser, the paths harder to navigate. I had gone for a short hike earlier, only to find that landmarks I had noticed before were gone, replaced by trees and underbrush that looked identical. I tried to retrace my steps and got disoriented, eventually finding myself near a small stream I hadn't noticed before. My heart rate picked up, and I realized I had no idea which direction led back to the cabin. It took almost an hour of cautious walking before I finally saw the familiar outline of the cabin through the trees. I felt a wave of relief, but also a creeping tension. The forest wasn't friendly. It wasn't dangerous in a direct sense, but it had an intensity, a way of making a person feel small, lost, and insignificant. That night, the unease grew stronger. I had been outside earlier than sunset and didn't notice that the shadows had started to shift in odd ways, stretching longer and darker as night fell. The wind picked up, rustling through the branches with an almost deliberate persistence. My fire was small, barely enough to keep the darkness at bay in the corners of the room. I ate a simple meal, then moved closer to the fireplace, noticing that the shadows cast by the logs seemed to stretch unnaturally across the walls. I told myself I was imagining things. My mind was just tired from the drive and the long hours at work before I left. The rational part of me tried to dismiss the sudden creaking of the cabin floorboards, the sound of branches scratching against the roof, and the occasional thump outside, which I guessed was a deer or raccoon moving through the underbrush. But deep down, I felt a prickling tension, a sense that being this isolated made me vulnerable in a way I hadn't anticipated. The third day, I noticed that something had changed. The feeling of isolation was no longer comfortable, it was oppressive. The forest seemed denser, the paths harder to navigate. I had gone for a short hike earlier, only to find that landmarks I had noticed before were gone, replaced by trees and underbrush that looked identical. I tried to retrace my steps and got disoriented, eventually finding myself near a small stream I hadn't noticed before. My heart rate picked up, and I realized I had no idea which direction led back to the cabin. It took almost an hour of cautious walking before I finally saw the familiar outline of the cabin through the trees. I felt a wave of relief, but also a creeping tension. The forest wasn't friendly. It wasn't dangerous in a direct sense, but it had an intensity, a way of making a person feel small, lost, and insignificant. That night, the wind grew stronger, rattling the windows and making the trees groan under the pressure. I had secured the cabin, but the sound of branches scraping against the roof made sleep impossible. I lay awake, listening, trying to convince myself that I was safe. I checked the locks repeatedly, walked around with a flashlight, and even examined the perimeter, making sure that no animals had come close. But the forest pressed against the cabin in an almost tangible way, and I realized that my solitude had a cost. Being alone in a place this remote made everything sharper, more intense, more consuming. On the fourth day, I decided to go for a longer hike, hoping the exercise would distract me from the tension in the cabin. I packed water, food, and a small first aid kit, then set off. The path quickly disappeared into thick forest, and I had to rely on a map I had printed earlier and the small trail markers I had noticed. Hours passed as I navigated uneven terrain, crossed shallow streams, and pushed through brambles. At first, it was invigorating. I felt connected to nature in a way I hadn't before. But then I realized something unsettling. The sun was lower than I expected. I had miscalculated the time, and the forest was growing dim. I tried to turn back, but everything looked unfamiliar. Trees, rocks, and paths seemed to shift subtly, making it almost impossible to retrace my steps. Panic rose in my chest. I checked my phone, no signal. The map helped only partially. My surroundings didn't match what I expected. I tried to stay calm, breathing deeply, but every snap of a branch, every rustle in the leaves, made my pulse quicken. Hours passed. Darkness descended quickly in the forest, swallowing the faint light from the fading sun. I realized I was lost. The forest, once inviting, was now a maze of shadows and uncertainty. I walked slowly, trying to find any clue, any sign of the cabin or a familiar landmark. The air grew colder, and I shivered despite my jacket. I remembered the flashlight in my pack and turned it on, its beam cutting through the gloom. Then I heard it, a low, distant sound, like a heavy footstep or a tree branch breaking under weight. My heart leapt. It wasn't loud, but it carried in the stillness. I froze, straining to hear. There it was again. Another sound, closer this time. Not an animal, I realized. Not a deer or raccoon. This was deliberate, human. My mind raced. I had no way of knowing who it was or what they wanted. I gripped the flashlight tightly, preparing myself to run or defend myself if necessary. I moved cautiously, keeping to the shadows, using the flashlight sparingly. Every step was measured. The sound followed me at a distance, always just out of reach, but persistent. My anxiety mounted. The isolation I had enjoyed now felt like a trap. I had left the safety of the cabin and wandered into a place where I was completely vulnerable. Eventually, I saw a faint light through the trees. Relief surged. It was the cabin. I broke into a run, adrenaline carrying me across the forest floor. The closer I got, the more I noticed that the cabin looked different. More exposed somehow, as if the door had been moved slightly. I reached it and fumbled with the lock, finally managing to secure the door behind me. Inside, I bolted all the doors and windows. I checked every corner, every dark space, until I was satisfied I was alone. I collapsed into the armchair near the fireplace, hands trembling, heart still racing. The forest outside was quiet again, but the sense of vulnerability lingered. I realized how fragile the barrier between safety and danger could be in a place like this. Over the next 2 days, I barely left the cabin. I observed the forest from the windows, watching birds and deer, but never venturing far. I maintained my fire, prepared food, and did everything I could to feel in control. When I left, it would be light, with a clear path back to the road. I didn't want to risk another encounter, not with the forest, not with another person. By the 7th day, I was ready to leave. The tension, the fear, the uncertainty had left a mark, but I also felt a strange kind of accomplishment. I had faced isolation in its purest form, had been lost, and had survived. I packed my belongings carefully, made sure the cabin was as I had found it, and started the drive back to civilization. As the city lights appeared in the distance, the noise and movement felt overwhelming at first, but then comforting. I had returned to safety, to structure and predictability. The experience in the forest stayed with me. The quiet, the intensity, the sense of vulnerability. But I had learned something vital. Even in fear, careful observation, preparation, and patience could carry a person through danger and uncertainty. I had faced a very real, very human kind of fear, and I had come out the other side clear-headed and alive. The memory of that week in the cabin never left me. It was a reminder of how delicate our sense of safety is, and how quickly it can be disrupted by simple isolation. But it was also a reminder of resilience. I had faced the unknown and I had survived. And that clarity, that understanding of my own limits and strengths, stayed with me long after the forest had faded from view. I had been planning the trip for months, marking off a remote corner of the mountains that I had found on an old map online. The cabin was small and old, tucked deep into the pine forest, far from the nearest road. Most people would call it isolation, but for me it was exactly what I wanted. Nothing but silence, cold air, and the chance to disconnect from the world for a few days. I packed carefully, double-checking everything. Food, water, blankets, a small first aid kit, and a couple of spare clothes. I also brought a flashlight, some extra batteries, and my small pocket knife. I thought I had covered everything, but I was about to find out that no amount of preparation could ever truly account for being completely alone in the wilderness. The drive up the narrow dirt road was longer than I expected. The GPS kept recalculating, leading me over ruts and through patches of mud that slowed the car to a crawl. I passed a few abandoned farmhouses, their windows boarded up and roofs sagging. The further I went, the quieter it became. The wind rustled through the trees, but no cars, no other people, no signs of life. When I finally parked near the trailhead that led to the cabin, my car sank slightly into soft, wet soil. I took a deep breath, swung my backpack over my shoulders, and started the walk. The trail was rough, overgrown in some parts, with exposed roots that could easily trip someone if they weren't careful. I was alone, and the thought that no one would hear me if I fell made me tense. I kept moving, telling myself to stay alert, and tried to enjoy the crunch of leaves under my boots and the scent of pine. After almost 2 hours of hiking uphill, I caught the first glimpse of the cabin. It was exactly as the photos had shown. Small, weathered, with a steep roof and a tiny porch. The wood was darkened by years of rain and snow. Windows were grimy, but intact, and the door had a sturdy iron latch. I set my backpack down and went around the outside, checking that the cabin was structurally sound. everything seemed fine. There were no obvious signs of recent visitors, no footprints other than mine, no discarded trash. The quiet was so thick that I could hear the occasional snap of a branch in the distance, but it didn't feel menacing yet. Once inside, I made a quick inventory. The cabin had a small kitchen with a wood stove, a few shelves, a table with 2 chairs, and a small bedroom with a single bed and a thin mattress. There was a box of matches, some old cans of food, and a rusty pot. I lit a fire in the stove, grateful for the warmth. The first night passed without incident, though I kept waking at odd hours, alert to every creak, groan, and gust of wind outside. The next morning, I decided to explore the area. I hiked around the cabin, noting a small stream a short distance away and some flat areas I could use for cooking or setting up a fire pit. The forest was dense, the pines tall, with little underbrush in some areas but thick brambles in others. I felt safe in the daylight, though the sense of isolation was already pressing in. By the second day, I noticed signs of wildlife. Deer tracks by the stream, fresh droppings, and even the distant sound of a coyote howling. The forest was alive, but it was a wildlife that didn't care about me. I was careful not to leave food lying around, storing it in my backpack instead, hung from a tree branch each night. On the third day, something changed. I had gone further along the trail, taking note of landmarks and trying to get my bearings for a longer hike, when I found something that didn't belong. A pair of boot prints, fresh, large, and leading deeper into the forest. I froze and watched, noticing how the prints seemed deliberate, heavy, and unnaturally straight, as if someone had been following the trail for a reason. I scanned the trees, looking for movement, but saw nothing. My stomach clenched. I had told myself there would be no one else here, yet clearly there was someone or something. I hurried back to the cabin, trying to keep calm. By the time I arrived, I double-checked the locks and reinforced the door with a chair wedged against it. That night, every sound outside became magnified. I could hear branches scraping against the cabin, the wind, small animals, but somewhere deep in my gut, I knew it wasn't just wildlife. I stayed awake most of the night, sitting close to the fire, my knife in hand. The fear was different from the first nights. It wasn't loneliness anymore. It was being aware that someone might be watching me, that my isolation could be exploited. The fourth day, I found more signs. Small bits of garbage, a wrapper, a piece of cloth snagged on a branch. Whoever had been here was moving quietly but deliberately. I realized that the cabin, which had seemed safe before, could now be a trap. Panic began to creep in, but I forced myself to think logically. I made a plan. Stay inside, don't venture far, and be ready to defend myself if necessary. That night, the sounds outside grew bolder. Heavy footsteps on the ground, a rhythmic scraping, and then a loud thump against the cabin door. I froze, heart pounding, gripping the knife tightly. I could hear my own breathing over the pounding wind, and yet I knew the door had not been hit by the wind. Something hit it deliberately. I waited, counting seconds, each one stretching unbearably. Then nothing. Silence. I couldn't sleep, of course, and the fire burned low. The next morning, I decided to explore the area. I hiked around the cabin, noting a small stream a short distance away and some flat areas I could use for cooking or setting up a fire pit. The forest was dense, the pines tall, with little underbrush in some areas but thick brambles in others. I felt safe in the daylight, though the sense of isolation was already pressing in. By the second day, I noticed signs of wildlife. Deer tracks by the stream, fresh droppings, and even the distant sound of a coyote howling. The forest was alive, but it was a wildlife that didn't care about me. I was careful not to leave food lying around, storing it in my backpack instead, hung from a tree branch each night. On the third day, something changed. I had gone further along the trail, taking note of landmarks and trying to get my bearings for a longer hike, when I found something that didn't belong. A pair of boot prints, fresh, large, and leading deeper into the forest. I froze and watched, noticing how the prints seemed deliberate, heavy, and unnaturally straight, as if someone had been following the trail for a reason. I scanned the trees, looking for movement, but saw nothing. My stomach clenched. I had told myself there would be no one else here, yet clearly there was someone or something. I hurried back to the cabin, trying to keep calm. By the time I arrived, I double-checked the locks and reinforced the door with a chair wedged against it. That night, every sound outside became magnified. I could hear branches scraping against the cabin, the wind, small animals, but somewhere deep in my gut, I knew it wasn't just wildlife. I stayed awake most of the night, sitting close to the fire, my knife in hand. The fear was different from the first nights. It wasn't loneliness anymore. It was being aware that someone might be watching me, that my isolation could be exploited. The fourth day, I found more signs. Small bits of garbage, a wrapper, a piece of cloth snagged on a branch. Whoever had been here was moving quietly but deliberately. I realized that the cabin, which had seemed safe before, could now be a trap. Panic began to creep in, but I forced myself to think logically. I made a plan. Stay inside, don't venture far, and be ready to defend myself if necessary. That night, the sounds outside grew bolder. Heavy footsteps on the ground, a rhythmic scraping, and then a loud thump against the cabin door. I froze, heart pounding, gripping the knife tightly. I could hear my own breathing over the pounding wind, and yet I knew the door had not been hit by the wind. Something hit it deliberately. I waited, counting seconds, each one stretching unbearably. Then nothing. Silence. I couldn't sleep, of course, and the fire burned low. The next morning, I discovered marks on the cabin door, scratches, deep enough to draw my attention. Whoever had been here was testing me, testing the cabin's defenses. I packed essentials: water, a few cans, my knife, and an old rope I found in a corner. I decided to leave the cabin behind. Staying was too dangerous. Isolation had turned from comfort to threat. I followed the trail down the mountain slowly, scanning for any sign of movement. The forest was quiet again, but I didn't trust it. My pace quickened when I heard the faint snap of a branch behind me, but when I turned, there was nothing. Sweat dripped down my forehead. My arms ached from carrying my backpack, and my legs trembled. I kept moving, one careful step after another. By evening, I reached a road, partially washed out but passable. I waited until a passing car approached, waving my arms frantically. The driver slowed, confusion and concern in their eyes. I gave them a brief explanation, barely coherent from exhaustion, and they agreed to drive me to the nearest town. Relief flooded me. I felt my muscles relax slightly, though my heart still raced. Later, at a small police station in town, I described the cabin and the tracks. They had received other reports of people trespassing in that area, someone who would follow hikers, leaving traces but never revealing themselves until threatened. I realized that the remote cabin I had chosen had made me a target. It wasn't haunted. It wasn't supernatural. It was human, and humans could be more frightening than anything else in the forest. Weeks later, I returned to the cabin with police officers. It was exactly as I had left it. Quiet, abandoned, seemingly harmless. Yet, the marks remained on the door, and the evidence of intrusion told the true story. I stayed nearby as the officers conducted a search. They found nothing, no one living in the woods, but more tracks indicated that someone had been moving through the area for days, observing, waiting. I left the cabin behind for good. The experience stayed with me long after. I replayed every step, every decision, every sound. It taught me how fragile safety can be, how isolation can be both a gift and a risk. I still hike, still seek quiet, but never again without being fully aware that there may be others, watching, waiting, and that fear is not always a product of imagination. Sometimes it is simply reality, and reality, as I learned in that cabin, can be more terrifying than any story we could invent. I had been planning this trip for months, trying to escape the noise of the city, the constant buzzing of work emails, and the endless push of responsibilities that seemed to pile up no matter what I did. The idea of spending a week alone in a cabin in the woods sounded like the perfect solution, a place where I could breathe and be completely on my own. I found a small cabin online, tucked away in a remote part of the mountains, far from the usual hiking trails and tourist areas. The pictures made it look perfect. A small wooden structure, surrounded by dense trees, with a fire pit outside and a small stream running nearby. The owner had assured me it was quiet, safe, and completely private. The price was reasonable for the seclusion it promised, and I had no doubts when I booked it. I drove for hours, following narrow, winding roads that gradually turned into dirt paths, each mile making me more and more isolated from the rest of the world. By the time I reached the last stretch, I could feel the tension in my shoulders start to ease. The sun was just beginning to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the forest. I pulled up to the cabin, and the quiet hit me like a wall. There was no sound of traffic, no distant voices, not even birds. The only thing I could hear was the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. The cabin looked exactly like the pictures, maybe even more rugged and real in person. I unloaded my car and carried in my bag, noting that the cabin had a small porch, a sturdy wooden door, and a lock that looked solid. Inside, it was clean and simple, with a small kitchen, a wood stove, a single bedroom, and a loft for extra sleeping space. It smelled faintly of wood and old fire smoke, but in a way that felt comforting rather than unpleasant. The first night passed uneventfully. I lit a fire in the stove, cooked a simple dinner, and then settled down with a book. The darkness outside was absolute, except for the faint silver glow of the moon filtering through the trees. At some point, I noticed the sound of the stream outside, gentle and constant. It was almost hypnotic, and I fell asleep to its rhythm. When I woke the next morning, the sunlight poured through the windows, and I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in years. I spent the day exploring the area, walking through the trees, and noting the wildlife. Birds, squirrels, the occasional deer. It all felt like a perfect escape. But then, on the second night, things started to feel off. I had gone out for a short hike and returned to the cabin just before sunset. I noticed that something was strange as soon as I stepped inside. My backpack, which I had left on the floor by the door, was slightly moved. Not far, just a few feet, but enough to make me pause. I told myself it must have fallen when I set it down earlier. I checked the doors and windows. They were all locked, the same way I had left them. Still, a small knot of unease started to form in my stomach. I tried to ignore it, focusing on making dinner and starting a fire in the stove. The crackling of the flames filled the cabin, and for a while the tension eased. But then I heard it, a soft, deliberate knock at the door. I froze. My heart raced, pounding in my chest. I wasn't expecting anyone. There was no road, no neighbor, no phone reception. Who would be here? I stayed still for what felt like an eternity, listening. There was another knock. I couldn't see anyone through the windows. The darkness outside was thick, almost tangible. I went to the door and checked the lock again. Still secure. The knocking had stopped, but my stomach didn't settle. I spent the rest of the night sitting near the stove, keeping the fire going, with my eyes fixed on the door. I didn't sleep much. The next day, I kept myself busy. I chopped firewood, cleaned the cabin, and went for another hike, this time taking a longer path through the woods. The sun was bright, the air was crisp, and I felt like I could breathe again. But in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. When I returned, the cabin looked exactly the same, but small things were out of place. The firewood pile was slightly disturbed. The kettle was not where I had left it. My unease grew, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe animals were moving things, or maybe I was imagining it. Still, I couldn't explain the knocks at the door the night before. That night, I decided to secure the cabin more thoroughly. I placed heavy furniture in front of the door, double-checked all the locks, and even blocked the windows with a few boards I found in the loft. I felt foolish doing it, but at the same time, I couldn't shake the growing sense of dread. I tried to read, but every sound outside made me jump. The wind in the trees sounded like footsteps. The stream sounded louder, more insistent, almost as if it carried voices. I kept checking the door, expecting it to burst open at any moment. I didn't sleep again that night. The following day, I decided to hike deeper into the woods, hoping that being far from the cabin would calm my nerves. The forest was dense, and the trails were barely visible. As I walked, I noticed broken branches and footprints in the mud. Some looked like animal tracks, but some were different, too large to be a deer, too human to be a bear. My heart started to race. I turned back, not wanting to go any further. I felt a gnawing fear that someone had been following me. When I returned to the cabin, everything seemed normal again, at least on the surface. But as I unpacked my bag, I found a small, carved stick lying on the floor. I had not seen it before. It was sharp and pointed, with notches cut into it. I had no idea how it got there. My hands shook as I picked it up. I realized then that my situation was more dangerous than I wanted to admit. Someone had been watching me, moving things around, entering the cabin when I was away. I felt trapped. The cabin that had once seemed like a refuge now felt like a cage. I considered leaving, but I was deep in the forest. The nearest road was miles away, and I had no signal on my phone. Panic settled in, and I started thinking about all the ways I could defend myself. I had a small camping knife, some matches, and a few supplies, but I was acutely aware that I was at the mercy of whoever had been here. That night, I barely dared to sleep. I kept the knife on my chest and stared at the door. At some point, I heard it again. Soft footsteps outside, circling the cabin. I could hear the crunch of leaves, deliberate and slow, moving around the perimeter. I stayed as quiet as I could, barely daring to breathe. The footsteps stopped. Then I heard a scraping sound against the door. My stomach turned. Whoever it was testing the lock, trying to see if the cabin was secure. I stayed still, praying they would leave. Hours passed, and eventually, the noises faded. I didn't sleep again. The next morning, I decided I had to leave. I couldn't stay another night knowing someone was out there, watching me. I packed everything quickly, making as little noise as possible. I checked the locks one last time, then stepped outside. I scanned the tree line, half expecting to see someone staring back at me. There was nothing, just the quiet, the stream, and the trees. I walked quickly toward the dirt road, constantly looking over my shoulder. The hike back to my car was tense, every rustle in the brush setting my nerves on edge. When I finally saw the car, relief washed over me. I jumped in, locked the doors, and drove away as fast as I could. Back in the city, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. For weeks, I kept checking my apartment, double-locking doors, even avoiding going out alone at night. Eventually, I contacted the local authorities where the cabin was, explaining what had happened. They investigated and found that a transient individual had been living in the woods nearby, moving between abandoned cabins. He had a history of following people, entering isolated homes, and stealing supplies. I never encountered him directly, but knowing he had been there, so close, made me realize how lucky I had been. In the end, I sold the cabin rental listing and vowed never to return to such an isolated place. The experience left me hyper-aware of my surroundings, cautious, and determined never to take safety for granted. I still love the idea of being in nature, but now I make sure I am never completely alone in a remote place. That week in the cabin taught me that isolation can be deadly, that fear can grow silently until it consumes you, and that sometimes the danger is not in the dark or in shadows, but in the quiet, invisible presence of someone watching. I survived, and the clarity of that lesson has stayed with me ever since, shaping the way I approach solitude, wilderness, and trust. I learned that preparation, awareness, and caution are not paranoia. They are survival. It started as an ordinary plan, the kind I had made countless times before. I was tired of the city, tired of the endless noise, and tired of people always moving too fast around me. I needed solitude, and the cabin seemed perfect. It was isolated deep in the forest, far from the main roads, almost impossible to reach without a sturdy vehicle. The photos online had promised peace, quiet, and an escape. What I didn't realize then was how fragile the sense of safety can be when you are completely alone. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun dipping toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the dense forest. The gravel road that led to the cabin had potholes and deep ruts, and it took me almost an hour to reach it from the last paved road. When I finally saw it, the cabin was smaller than I had imagined, made of dark stained wood, blending almost seamlessly into the surrounding pines. There was a small deck, weathered but sturdy, and a rusted metal roof that had clearly seen decades of storms. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles, crisp and cold, a welcome change from the city. I parked the car as close as I could get to the cabin without risking getting stuck in the soft ground. The tires sank slightly into the mud, and I made a mental note to bring a shovel or planks next time. I had packed lightly, some canned food, a few days' worth of water, a first aid kit, flashlight, batteries, and of course my laptop, though I doubted I would use it. I had deliberately left my phone in the car. I needed this to be real solitude, not a retreat where I could be contacted at any time. Inside, the cabin was empty except for basic furnishings. A small wooden table, 2 chairs, a worn sofa, and a narrow bed in the corner. There was a wood-burning stove, which I inspected immediately. It was clean and functional, though the chimney showed signs of needing a sweep. There was a stack of firewood in the corner, neatly cut, which was comforting. I set my things down and opened the windows to let in the evening air, the smell of pine filling the room. Outside, the forest was quiet, almost unnaturally so. There was no sound of traffic, no distant voices, only the occasional creak of a branch swaying in the wind. I started a fire, chopping some of the wood into kindling, and within an hour, the cabin was warm and glowing. I made some instant noodles and ate slowly, staring into the flames as night fell. The forest outside went from deep green to black almost instantly. Shadows moved in shapes I couldn't identify, and I felt that initial prickling of unease that comes when a place feels too empty, too quiet. But I rationalized it. This was normal. No one else was around, and the forest was old and dense. The sounds of animals would come and go, and my imagination was filling in the rest. I slept lightly that first night, waking more than once to creaks and the subtle snap of branches outside. The floorboards groaned under the weight of the house settling. I told myself, but part of me couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I checked the windows several times, half expecting to see someone there, but there was nothing. Just the shadows of trees, tall and dark, stretching across the ground. The second day, I explored the area around the cabin. There was a small clearing that looked like it had once been a garden, now overgrown with weeds and moss. I found an old trail leading deeper into the woods, narrow and overrun, but I followed it for maybe half an hour. It twisted and turned, rising and falling with the terrain, until I reached a small creek. The water was cold and clear, the kind you could drink if needed. I filled my bottle and rested on a rock, listening to the gentle sound of water running over stones. It was peaceful, almost beautiful, and I felt the first real sense of relaxation since I had left the city. When I returned to the cabin, the sun had dipped low, and the forest was dim. That's when I noticed the footprints. I saw them in the mud near the edge of the clearing, small, almost like someone had been wandering close to the cabin but hadn't approached it fully. They weren't fresh, probably a day or two old, but they were there, unmistakable in the soft earth. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't expected anyone else to be out here, not at this time of year. The cabin wasn't exactly hidden, but it was isolated enough that visitors would be rare. I rationalized it again. Maybe a hunter, maybe someone camping further in the woods, but I felt a tight knot in my chest. That night, I slept even less. Every sound outside, the snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves, made me sit up, alert. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch toward me, even though the fire in the stove cast a warm glow. I kept imagining someone standing at the edge of the clearing, watching. I checked the locks on the door, then the windows. Everything seemed secure. The next day, I told myself I would check the surrounding area more thoroughly. The third day, I decided to make a fire early and leave a trail of markers. Small sticks tied with pieces of cloth, so that if I needed to track my path in the forest, I could. I walked for hours, deeper into the woods, always checking for footprints, always scanning for anything unusual. felt like hours, though the forest didn't have a sense of time. By midday, I found more evidence of someone else having been there. Scraps of old food wrappers, a half-broken bottle, a makeshift fire pit that had long gone cold. This wasn't someone who lived here, but someone who had passed through, maybe a transient, maybe a person with no one to answer to. That night, the unease turned into something more tangible. I was awake late, lying on the sofa with the fire dying down to glowing embers. I thought I heard a branch snap closer than usual. I held my breath. Then something scraped against the side of the cabin. Not a large sound, just a subtle scratch, but enough to make my stomach knot. I stayed very still, listening. The sound came again, slow, deliberate, as if someone was moving around the perimeter. I wanted to call the police, but my phone had no signal, and I had left the car keys inside the cabin, parked about 50 feet away. I felt trapped. I stayed awake the rest of the night, fire constantly stoked, flashlight in hand. The woods were alive with sound, but none of it natural. I thought I saw shadows moving outside, just glimpses, never long enough to be certain. At dawn, I checked the perimeter. The ground was soft with morning dew, and I saw footprints circling the cabin, small, careful, deliberate. Someone had been there. They hadn't tried to enter, at least, but it was clear that I wasn't alone. Over the next 2 days, I set traps in my mind, ways to escape if needed. I moved my car to a slightly higher position in case I needed to leave quickly. I barricaded the doors with pieces of furniture and learned to sleep with one eye open, one hand always near the flashlight. Every sound, every rustle in the forest, made my pulse spike. The loneliness that had once felt peaceful now felt threatening. On the 5th night, things escalated. Around midnight, I heard a knock at the door. Hard, deliberate. I froze. My first instinct was disbelief. There shouldn't be anyone here. The cabin was deep in the forest, isolated. I didn't move, barely breathing, listening. Then came another knock, followed by the sound of scraping, like fingernails against wood. I realized whoever it was testing me, trying to see if I was awake, if I would respond. My heart was racing, hands shaking, but I stayed still. After what felt like hours but was probably 15 minutes, the sound stopped. I couldn't stay in the cabin. Not like this. I made a plan. At first light, I would leave no matter what. I packed essential things into a small backpack. Water, food, flashlight, first aid kit. I left the fire smoldering and pushed the furniture slightly back into place to make it look undisturbed. Morning came gray and cold. I moved cautiously, scanning the forest for movement. The car was where I had left it, but the ground around it was scuffed, footprints all around. I loaded my bag quickly, started the car, and drove slowly at first, watching for movement. Nothing. I kept driving down the narrow gravel road, ears straining for any unusual sound. The forest seemed alive, but empty at the same time. I stopped once, halfway back to the main road, to rest and drink water. My hands were still shaking, and my stomach felt tight. I realized how fragile the sense of safety is, how easy it is to feel exposed when you're truly alone. After a few minutes, I continued, keeping my eyes on the trees, my heart racing at every shadow. By the time I reached the paved road, I felt almost normal again, though exhausted. I never returned to that cabin. I reported it to the local authorities, describing the footprints and signs of intrusion. They said it could have been a transient or someone hiding in the woods, though they couldn't investigate every square mile of forest. I eventually rented another cabin elsewhere, one with more security, closer to people. The experience changed me. I realized how little control we have over our environment, how quickly solitude can become fear when others are involved. I learned to respect isolation, to prepare for the unknown, and to never underestimate the presence of another person when you think you are alone. Even now, months later, I replay the nights in that cabin. The silence, the shadows, the small but deliberate signs that I wasn't alone. I sleep with the door locked and check my surroundings, a habit I can't shake. I know the forest is indifferent, but people are not. That was the scariest lesson of all. I had planned the trip for months. The idea was simple. I needed a break from the city, from the endless noise, from the constant demands of work, the never-ending stream of emails, calls, and responsibilities. A week alone in the cabin, somewhere deep in the woods, seemed like the perfect escape. I packed meticulously, making sure I had everything I could think of. Enough food for a week, water, camping gear, a first aid kit, batteries, flashlights, and even a small handheld tool set. I wanted to feel prepared, like nothing could go wrong. I had rented a cabin that was supposed to be off the grid, miles away from the nearest road. Pictures online made it look isolated, but cozy, with a small fireplace, a modest kitchen, and large windows looking out over the dense forest. The drive there was long, winding through narrow roads that twisted around hills and valleys. I had to keep the speed low because the road was barely wide enough for one car, and trees pressed in on both sides. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already low in the sky, casting long shadows that danced between the trunks. Pulling up to the cabin, I noticed how silent it was. Not the pleasant kind of quiet, but a heavy, oppressive silence. No birds, no insects, no wind moving the trees, nothing. The kind of quiet that makes you notice every small sound your own body makes. The cabin itself was older than I expected. The wooden panels were weathered and some of the paint had peeled off. The door creaked when I opened it, and a faint smell of mildew greeted me. I set down my bags and took a moment to survey the inside. It had the basics: a small kitchen with a stove, a fridge that I immediately plugged in, a bathroom with a shower, and 2 small bedrooms. The living area was modest, with a table, a few chairs, and a couch. I unpacked quickly, trying to shake off the feeling of unease that had started to settle in. I told myself it was just the isolation, that I had imagined things in the forest on the drive up. I made a fire in the fireplace, sat on the couch, and tried to relax. Outside, the forest was turning black, but I couldn't bring myself to fully enjoy it. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the trees made me flinch. The first night was restless. I lay in the bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the forest. Around midnight, I thought I heard footsteps outside the cabin. At first, I assumed it was an animal, a deer or a raccoon, but the steps were deliberate, too heavy for most animals. I stayed still, trying to convince myself it was just the wind or a branch falling. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. I kept the lights low but left the fireplace burning, and eventually, sleep took me. Morning brought little comfort. The sun broke through the trees, but the forest seemed darker than usual. I had a simple breakfast and decided to explore the area around the cabin. There was a faint trail, overgrown and mostly unused, that led down to a small creek. The trail was uneven, roots and rocks protruding from the ground, and I had to be careful not to trip. The forest around me was quiet, almost unnaturally so. I didn't see any animals, not even birds, and the leaves on the trees barely moved. I tried to focus on the sounds of the creek, the water trickling over rocks, to calm myself, but the feeling of being watched never left me. That afternoon, I noticed tire tracks in the dirt near the trail. They weren't fresh, but they were recent enough to make me uneasy. Someone else had been here, alone, miles from the nearest road. This thought made my stomach twist. I returned to the cabin quickly, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was a ranger checking the area, or a neighbor I hadn't been aware of. Still, the thought stayed with me. I locked the doors and windows, double-checked that the lights worked, and tried to focus on my plans for the week. Reading, writing, and resting. By the second night, the isolation had started to gnaw at me. Every sound seemed amplified. The wind rattled the trees and made the roof creak. The fireplace crackled, and shadows danced across the walls. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was outside, just beyond the windows. I kept the curtains drawn, but I still felt exposed. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. Footsteps, deliberate and slow, moving around the perimeter of the cabin. My heart raced, but I forced myself to stay calm. I grabbed the flashlight and peered out the window, but there was nothing there. No one, no movement. I checked every window, every door, and tried to convince myself it was the wind, or maybe a deer walking on the fallen branches. Sleep came in fits, and I woke multiple times to the sound of footsteps that never seemed to approach the cabin directly. The third day was tense. I decided to venture farther, hoping that being occupied would keep my mind off the fear. I followed a narrow path deeper into the forest, keeping a mental note of landmarks so I could find my way back. The further I went, the wilder the forest became. Trees grew close together, and sunlight barely touched the ground. I passed fallen logs, tangled roots, and patches of thick underbrush. At one point, I stumbled across an old campsite, long abandoned. There were rusted cans and a small fire pit with blackened stones. It looked as though someone had been there years ago. It was unsettling, the reminder that people had lived in this wilderness before me, and that the forest didn't forgive carelessness. By late afternoon, I realized I had lost track of the trail. I tried retracing my steps, but everything looked the same. Panic started to rise as I realized how disoriented I was. The trees all looked alike, the underbrush thick, and the light was fading fast. I turned back and tried a different direction, but the forest seemed endless. Shadows lengthened, and the rustling of leaves made me jump at every sound. I finally stumbled across a small clearing where a faint path led in what I hoped was the right direction. I followed it cautiously, feeling more and more vulnerable with every step. When I finally returned to the cabin, it was dusk. Relief washed over me, but it was mingled with a growing sense of dread. I locked the doors and windows and decided to stay inside for the evening. I checked the perimeter with the flashlight, scanning for any signs of trespassers. Everything seemed normal, no footprints, no tire tracks, but the feeling of being watched never left me. That night, I barely slept. I lay awake listening to the forest, the wind, the occasional snap of a branch. I started to notice patterns. Footsteps that circled the cabin, faint shadows moving between the trees, the occasional reflection of light against the windows as if someone was outside, watching. By the fourth day, I was exhausted. I rationed my food, trying to conserve energy. I stayed inside most of the day, reading and keeping a fire going to maintain some sense of normalcy. In the afternoon, I went outside briefly to fetch water from the creek. The forest seemed more oppressive than ever. Every sound was magnified. The squawk of a bird in the distance, the rustle of leaves, the snapping of twigs under my boots. I felt exposed and vulnerable, a tiny human in a vast, indifferent wilderness. As I returned to the cabin, I noticed something I had missed before: scratches on the outer walls. They were shallow but deliberate, marks that weren't there when I first arrived. My stomach twisted. Whoever or whatever had done this was close, perhaps even nearby. I double-checked the locks, reinforced the doors with the tools I had, and spent the night in the living room with the flashlight and an axe close at hand. The fifth night was the worst. Around midnight, I heard the unmistakable sound of someone trying the door handle. My heart raced, and my hands shook as I gripped the axe. The door rattled once, then again, harder. Someone was outside. I forced myself to stay calm and silent, waiting, listening. The sound stopped after a few moments. I stayed crouched by the door, breathing slowly, eyes darting to every shadow. Hours passed. Eventually, I heard nothing but the wind, and the fear became almost unbearable. I realized then that I couldn't stay in the cabin forever, that the isolation and the threat of someone intruding had turned the place into a trap. At first light, I decided to leave. I packed quickly, making sure I had everything I could carry. My plan was to drive back to the nearest town to safety. I double-checked the doors, grabbed my bags, and stepped outside. The forest was quiet, almost eerily so. The scratches on the cabin seemed more pronounced in the morning light. I walked carefully to the car, keeping an eye on the shadows, and finally started the engine. The drive out was tense. Every sound, every movement in the trees made me flinch. I stuck to the narrow roads, eyes on the path, heart pounding with every unexpected crack of a branch under the tires. Eventually, I reached the main road. Relief flooded me. The silence of the forest was replaced with the distant hum of traffic, birds, and civilization. When I finally arrived in town, I stopped at a gas station to collect myself. I told the attendant I had rented a cabin for a week and that I had decided to leave early. He nodded without comment, but I could see the quiet curiosity in his eyes. I didn't care. I needed to be out, to be safe, to be away from the oppressive stillness and the unknown threat of whoever had been circling that cabin. Later, when I returned home, I reported what I found at the cabin to the local authorities. They took my statement seriously, noting the marks on the cabin and the tire tracks. I never received any follow-up, but I knew that someone had been there, that I had narrowly avoided a situation that could have been much worse. I never returned to that part of the woods, and I never rented a cabin alone again. The experience left a permanent mark, a reminder of how quickly solitude can turn into danger, and how small and vulnerable a person really is when faced with the unknown. Even now, I can remember the smell of the cabin, the way the shadows moved across the walls, the oppressive silence of the forest. The experience taught me to respect isolation, to understand the raw, indifferent power of nature, and to never underestimate the danger that human threats can pose when combined with the vulnerability of being alone. It was a week I had planned for peace, and instead, I found fear, but I also found resilience. I made it out alive, and I carried every detail with me, a vivid memory that has never left. I never thought a simple weekend getaway could turn into something I would never forget. I had planned it as a break from everything: work, city noise, constant screens, and endless emails. A cabin in the middle of a forest seemed perfect. The idea of waking up to the sound of birds, making coffee with a view of tall trees and misty hills, and spending the day reading and hiking had sounded like heaven. I arrived just before sunset, the sky streaked with orange and red, the way it always looks when the day seems quiet, peaceful, and untouched. The cabin itself was old but solid, built from thick logs, with a small porch and a chimney that I assumed still worked. The surrounding forest was dense, with tall pines and maples that swayed gently in the wind. There were no neighbors, no houses visible from any angle. The isolation was exactly what I wanted. The first night was ordinary. I unpacked, made a small fire in the stove, and ate a simple meal I had brought along. The silence was comforting at first, the kind of quiet where you could hear your own heartbeat if you wanted to. But as night deepened, the silence became heavy. Every creak of the cabin, every whisper of wind against the windows, felt amplified. It wasn't that I felt unsafe yet. It was just a strange awareness of being alone, completely alone in a place where no one could hear you if something went wrong. I made myself a strong cup of tea, lit every lamp, and tried to read. The fire crackled and popped, shadows dancing along the log walls. I went to bed early, telling myself I was imagining things, that this was normal, that the forest at night had a way of making everything feel larger than it was. Morning came slowly. Sunlight filtered through the trees in gold and green. The air smelled clean, damp, and earthy. I had a long hike planned. I laced up my boots, packed a small backpack with water, some sandwiches, a flashlight, and a basic first aid kit, and set off along a trail I had marked on the cabin map. The forest was serene in the morning light, the kind of beauty you can get lost in. Birds called from above, and the wind rustled the leaves in a soft, hypnotic rhythm. The hike was challenging but not dangerous, with a few steep inclines and fallen trees to navigate. I took breaks, resting on mossy rocks, drinking water, taking in the endless greenery. Everything felt peaceful, untouched, a place out of time. I had been walking for a few hours when I noticed something strange. It was subtle at first, a branch broken in a strange way, as if something had forced its way through. Then I saw footprints, human footprints, leading off the trail and into a part of the forest that looked less traveled. My heart picked up. I stopped, listened, but all I could hear was the wind and the occasional bird. The footprints were fresh. Whoever or whatever made them had been here recently. I debated turning back. I told myself it was probably another hiker, maybe someone who had gotten lost and was wandering. I decided to follow the trail back toward the cabin. I didn't want to go deeper into the forest without knowing what was out there. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed something else. The door that I had locked before leaving was slightly ajar. My stomach sank. I remembered locking it firmly, the bolt sliding into place with a click. Now it was open just enough that I could slip my hand in and feel the edge of the door frame. I froze. No signs of forced entry, no broken windows. Just the door open. I stepped inside cautiously, every sense on alert. The cabin looked the same as when I had left. Nothing appeared stolen. Nothing seemed disturbed. Yet, the fact that the door had opened itself or someone had opened it shook me more than anything I had ever experienced. I spent the rest of that day double-checking everything. Windows, locks, the chimney flue. I even moved some furniture around, making mental notes of where everything was. I had to tell myself that it was probably a mistake. Maybe the door hadn't latched properly, or the wind had blown it open. Still, the thought that someone could be nearby, watching, made the air feel heavier, thicker. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed by the fire with a knife on the table, my flashlight within arm's reach. Every shadow on the walls, every creak in the floor made me flinch. The following morning, I tried to continue with normal plans, hoping it had just been a random incident. I went for another hike, but this time I stayed on the main trail and kept my phone in hand. That's when I saw them. A figure moving between the trees, far enough away that I couldn't see clearly, but close enough that my heart stopped. I froze, unsure whether to run or hide. The figure didn't seem to notice me at first. I watched as it moved, slow, methodical, almost like it was searching for something. I ducked behind a tree, my breath shallow, my mind racing. My first thought was to retreat to the cabin, but then I realized I had left my backpack by a fallen log where I had been resting. I had to get it. Every instinct screamed at me not to move, but I slowly edged toward the log, keeping my body low and behind cover. The figure had not noticed me yet, but I knew it could at any second. I grabbed my backpack, fumbling with the straps, heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst. That's when the figure turned sharply, almost like it had sensed movement. It stopped, scanning the trees. My stomach lurched. I crouched lower, holding my breath. It didn't move toward me, but the way it paused, tense and deliberate, told me it was aware of my presence. I bolted, running as fast as I could through the undergrowth, branches slapping my arms and face, tripping over roots, every step fueled by pure fear. The cabin appeared ahead, a sanctuary I had once taken for granted. I slammed the door behind me and locked it, sliding the bolt into place. I spent the next several hours inside, watching the forest, listening for any sign of movement. I tried to call for help, but cell service was patchy. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the road back to town was a narrow, winding path. I realized just how isolated I truly was. The thought that someone had been in the forest, following me, possibly knowing my exact location, made me feel trapped, but I couldn't leave either. I had to wait for daylight for some sense of safety. Over the next 2 days, I stayed inside almost entirely. I didn't light the fire at night, afraid it would signal my presence. I rationed food and water carefully. Every sound outside made me tense. Every rustle of leaves or crack of a branch felt like a threat. I slept only in short bursts, crouched near the door, ready to defend myself. I started noticing small details. Footprints near the cabin, the smell of smoke in the air that wasn't mine, broken twigs forming strange patterns near the trail. Whoever had been here was clever, cautious, leaving just enough to unsettle me but not enough to confront me directly. On the third night, the fear turned physical. I heard something moving outside the window, deliberate and slow. It stopped at the edge of the porch. I couldn't see through the darkness, but I could feel it, like a weight pressing down on the cabin. My body trembled. I gripped the knife tightly, telling myself to stay calm, telling myself I could survive this. Then I remembered the emergency flare I had packed. I had brought it for hiking emergencies, not for someone stalking me, but it was a last resort. I held it in my hand, ready to light it if I had to. The night stretched endlessly. I heard breathing, or maybe it was the wind, moving in strange ways. Shadows flickered in unnatural patterns. Hours passed. Finally, as the first light of dawn touched the treetops, everything outside became clear. Footprints led away from the cabin, deeper into the forest. They were recent, but now the threat seemed gone. I didn't know if the person had left voluntarily or had just observed me, but the immediate danger had passed. I felt relief, cautious and slow, but real. I spent the rest of the morning checking the perimeter, reinforcing the door, and preparing for a quick departure. By the afternoon, I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed everything, double-checked the cabin for anything left behind, and set out along the main road. I kept my eyes on the trees, scanning constantly. I didn't see anyone. I didn't hear anyone. But I didn't stop until I reached the main highway, where cars passed frequently, where people were visible, where civilization felt tangible again. I called the local police, explained the situation, and gave them the cabin location. They promised to check it, but I didn't wait for confirmation. I drove back to the city, exhausted, tense, and deeply shaken. When I finally reached home, I locked every door and window, double-checked the alarms, and sat down in the quiet, safe, familiar space of my apartment. I realized how unprepared I had been, how easy it could have gone wrong, how close I had been to a real, serious danger. The cabin had promised peace, isolation, and a break from everything, but it had delivered fear, a lesson in vigilance, and an understanding that being alone in the wild carries real, human dangers. Not ghosts, not monsters, just people who might be willing to take advantage of isolation. In the following days, I stayed home, slowly processing the experience. I learned about self-defense, safety in remote areas, and the importance of always letting someone know where you are. I returned to the forest months later, but only on guided trails with groups of people and never alone again. The cabin, the forest, and the quiet that had once promised peace now felt like a memory of vulnerability, a reminder that danger is sometimes invisible, human, and very real. I never went back to that particular cabin. I still dream about it sometimes, the smell of wet pine, the cold touch of fear at night, the feeling of being watched. But I also carry the lesson I learned there. Respect isolation, prepare for every possibility, and never underestimate the quiet, unseen danger that can exist anywhere, even in the most beautiful places. I survived, and I survived because I paid attention, stayed alert, and never let fear paralyze me completely. The experience left me scarred, cautious, but alive, and more aware of the world and the people in it than I ever had been before. I had been planning this trip for months, obsessing over every detail. I wanted to escape the noise of the city, the constant hum of traffic, the fluorescent lights that never seemed to turn off. I had found a small cabin deep in the forest, far from any main road, far from anyone. The listing was simple: a rustic cabin, no Wi-Fi, no cell service, completely off the grid. The photos had shown a wooden structure, surrounded by tall pines, a small creek running nearby. It looked perfect, like something out of a magazine. I didn't consider it dangerous. I thought of it as peaceful, a chance to reconnect with nature, to be completely alone. I packed my backpack carefully. Food for a week, water, a small gas stove, blankets, a first aid kit, a flashlight with extra batteries, a hand axe, and a few tools. I wanted to be prepared. The drive out of the city was long and tiring. My car groaned over potholes and uneven asphalt as the urban sprawl gradually dissolved into trees, thick and quiet. The sun was just beginning to drop below the horizon as I turned onto a narrow dirt road, lined with dense undergrowth that seemed almost unnatural in its thickness. I hadn't seen a car in nearly an hour. The road narrowed further, twisting around low hills, the overhanging branches scraping the sides of my car. I had to slow down to avoid losing control on the loose gravel. At some point, I realized I hadn't seen a sign of civilization for miles. The air felt heavier, cooler. There was a strange silence, not the peaceful quiet of nature, but a heavy, almost oppressive quiet, broken only by the occasional crack of a branch somewhere in the woods. My stomach tightened, but I told myself I was being paranoid. I had been alone in nature before. I could handle it. Finally, I reached a small clearing. The cabin was there, exactly as the photos had shown. But in the fading light it looked darker, more isolated, almost brooding. It was wooden, with a simple porch, a metal roof, and a thin trail leading to the creek behind it. The air smelled of wet pine and earth. I parked my car near the cabin and started unloading my gear. The first thing I noticed was how still everything was. Not a bird, not an insect, not even the rustle of leaves. I shrugged it off, thinking it was the calm before nightfall. The inside of the cabin was simple but livable. There was a small kitchen area with a sink and a wood-burning stove, a main room with a table and 2 chairs, and a loft with a mattress. Dust covered the surfaces, but it smelled clean, as though someone had left it in a hurry. I unpacked my things, setting food in the small refrigerator and stacking firewood near the stove. I made a small fire, enjoying the crackle and warmth, feeling the tension in my shoulders ease slightly. Outside, the last light of day disappeared, leaving only darkness. The windows reflected the firelight, and I realized that beyond the glass, the forest was a wall of black. I could barely make out the outline of trees. I decided to check the perimeter of the cabin. With my flashlight in hand, I walked around the building. The ground was uneven, with roots and rocks that threatened to trip me. I noticed footprints in the dirt, too large for an animal, spaced irregularly, as if someone had been walking around recently. My heart rate picked up. I told myself it could be the previous owner or a hiker, but instinct told me to be careful. I circled the cabin once, saw nothing else, and returned inside, locking the door behind me. I placed the axe near the bed, not because I expected trouble, but because the feeling of safety was fragile, easily broken by this isolation. That night, I slept lightly, waking to every small noise, the groan of the wooden walls settling, the whisper of the wind through the trees. The next day, I set about exploring. I wanted to familiarize myself with the area, to know the creek, the paths, and the small hills around the cabin. The morning was bright, the sunlight filtering through the pine needles, creating sharp, dancing shadows on the forest floor. I walked along the creek, watching the water swirl around mossy stones, listening to the faint sounds of frogs and distant birds. It was beautiful, peaceful almost, and I allowed myself to feel the relief of isolation. But as I walked, I noticed signs that unsettled me. Broken branches at odd angles, patches of disturbed soil, and again, the large footprints. They were deeper near the creek, as if someone had been dragging something heavy. I tried to rationalize. Perhaps an animal, a deer maybe. But the depth of the prints, the shape, the stride, it was definitely human. I returned to the cabin, feeling a prickling unease. The evening brought darkness quickly. I lit the fire again and cooked a small meal. As I sat eating, I heard a noise outside, faint at first, like gravel shifting under weight. My stomach tightened. I froze, straining to hear. The noise came again, closer, circling the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and axe and stepped onto the porch. The forest was a dark wall, and for a long time I saw nothing. Then a shadow moved, just a movement among the trees, too deliberate to be an animal. I felt my pulse spike. I returned inside, locked all the doors, and sat with the axe in my lap, listening to the soft sounds of the forest. I didn't sleep that night, every crack and snap outside making me jump. The next day, I decided to make a plan. I couldn't just sit there waiting for whoever or whatever was outside. I checked the map, noting the nearest main road. It was several miles away, a long hike through dense forest. My car was too far to risk leaving without preparation. I spent the day fortifying the cabin. I stacked extra firewood near the windows for barricades, tied heavy furniture to door handles, and set the axe in multiple accessible locations. I also prepared an emergency bag with food, water, and essential gear, in case I needed to leave quickly. By the time night fell, the cabin felt more like a bunker than a home, but it was still vulnerable. Whoever had been moving around outside could have circled the cabin at any time. That night, the noises started again. At first subtle, almost shy, then deliberate, closer, like someone walking just beyond the tree line. My flashlight picked up movement, shapes crouched, moving slowly, almost methodically. I could see shadows flicking between the trunks. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating. My hands shook as I gripped the axe. I didn't know if I should stay hidden or try to confront it, and I realized the uncertainty was worse than any actual danger. Hours passed, the sounds never leaving. I didn't eat, didn't move much, just listened. Every time a branch snapped too sharply, I flinched. I tried to keep calm, reminding myself that fear can make you imagine things, but the footprints in the morning had been real, and these movements were real too. I had no one to call, no help. I was completely alone except for whoever or whatever was out there. The following day, I decided I couldn't stay put. I would hike to the road carefully, quietly. I packed my bag, ensuring I had enough water, food, and a way to defend myself. I waited until the sun was high, hoping the light would give me confidence and visibility. I left the cabin carefully, keeping my backpack on, my axe in hand, moving slowly through the forest. I avoided the main trail, sticking to undergrowth where I could move silently. The forest was disorienting, with trees that all looked the same, uneven ground, and undergrowth that tore at my clothes. I moved for hours, constantly glancing over my shoulder. I thought I saw shapes moving behind trees, fleeting glimpses that made me jump. Each time, I reminded myself that it could be an animal, but the feeling of being followed never left me. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made my heart race. As evening approached, I realized I had lost my sense of direction. I had been moving carefully, but the dense forest made it easy to wander. Panic threatened to take over. I found a small clearing and climbed onto a rock, trying to see the road, but all I could see were trees stretching endlessly in every direction. I sat down, trying to calm myself. My energy was low, my muscles ached, and I realized that I needed a new plan. I couldn't afford to wander at night in this forest. I decided to backtrack to the cabin. It was safer to regroup than to risk getting lost completely. I marked a few trees with small cuts from my knife to track my way back, and slowly, painfully retraced my steps. Returning to the cabin felt like relief, though I knew I wasn't safe. The sun had almost set when I reached the clearing. I could see the cabin, the familiar shape, and my stomach tightened with both relief and dread. I entered carefully, checking all the locks and reinforcing the windows again. That night I couldn't sleep. The noises outside had grown louder, more confident. I could hear footsteps circling, slow, deliberate movements. It was as if someone was testing me, testing the cabin. I stayed awake all night, axe in hand, muscles tense. I rationed my water and food, knowing I had no way of knowing how long this could last. Days passed like this. I tried to maintain a routine, checking the perimeter, fortifying the cabin, keeping a fire going, but the presence outside never left. I became hyper-aware, noticing every small detail. A broken branch, a disturbed patch of soil, the way the wind carried sounds differently. I slept in short bursts, always with my axe nearby. Food ran low, and I had to decide whether to risk going outside or to try to conserve what I had. The thought of leaving the cabin felt impossible, yet staying trapped inside felt unbearable. Each night, the steps outside drew closer, sometimes pausing near the windows, just long enough to make me freeze with fear. Finally, after nearly a week, I noticed a pattern. Whoever was outside seemed to move mostly at night and avoid the light. I realized I could take advantage of daylight to escape. I packed my bag as carefully as possible, leaving minimal traces that might indicate my plan. I waited until the morning sun was high, bright enough to make shadows short and movement obvious. I took a deep breath, and then I ran, staying low, moving quickly through undergrowth, constantly scanning for movement. I followed the creek downstream, thinking water might lead me to civilization. Hours passed, and exhaustion set in, my legs trembling, my lungs burning, but I kept moving, pushing through the fear and fatigue. Eventually, I heard a distant hum, a vehicle engine. My heart leapt. I ran toward it, breaking through the last line of trees to find a small road. A car passed by, slowing as the driver saw me. I waved frantically, and the driver stopped, letting me climb in. I explained my situation briefly, barely coherent from fear and exhaustion, and they offered to take me to the nearest town. I left the forest behind, my body shaking, adrenaline fading slowly into exhaustion. The cabin, the footprints, the endless days of fear, they stayed with me as a memory, a warning. I realized how vulnerable isolation can make you, how quickly the mind reacts to threats when there is no one to help. In the days after, I reported the cabin and the footprints to the authorities. They investigated but found little. No one in the area, no signs of permanent habitation, only the disturbed ground around the cabin. I never went back, and I never will. But the fear I felt in those dark nights, hearing footsteps circling just beyond my walls, stayed with me. It was real, and it reminded me that even the quietest, most peaceful places can hide danger. I learned to respect isolation, to prepare, to never assume that being alone in nature is safe. It was a lesson I would carry forever. I had been looking forward to this weekend for months. The city felt like a cage most of the time, crowded and loud, and the only thing I craved was the quiet of the woods. I found the cabin online, tucked into a patch of forest that seemed untouched on any map I could find. The reviews were sparse but positive, which for me meant it was the kind of place where I could be completely alone. I packed enough food for 3 days, a sleeping bag, a small first aid kit, my flashlight, and a knife that had belonged to my grandfather. It wasn't much, but I liked the feeling of being prepared without being weighed down. The drive was long, longer than I expected. The GPS lost signal after a while, and I had to rely on the sun, the position of the trees, and a rough sense of direction. It was quiet, mostly, except for the crunch of gravel under the tires and the occasional crow overhead. I kept thinking I might have missed a turn somewhere, but there was nothing but dense forest on either side of the narrow dirt road. I finally spotted a small wooden sign, half fallen and covered in moss, that had the name of the cabin faintly carved into it. A shiver ran down my spine, partly from the thrill, partly from the feeling of being entirely alone. The cabin itself was smaller than I expected. 2 stories, made of dark wood that had weathered to a dull brown. The windows were dirty but not broken, and the porch sagged a little under my weight as I stepped onto it. The door opened easily, and inside it smelled like wood smoke and damp earth. I hadn't seen anyone else here for miles, and that made the silence feel heavier somehow. The furniture was simple, mostly a table, a couple of chairs, and a small stove in the corner. The floor creaked under my feet as I walked around, inspecting the place. I unpacked, storing the food in a small cupboard and laying out my sleeping bag near the fireplace. I lit the stove to get the place warm. The light of the fire made shadows flicker on the walls, and I felt a strange mixture of comfort and unease. The first night was quiet, the kind of quiet where every sound, the wind brushing through the trees, a branch tapping against the window, feels magnified. I barely slept, tossing and turning, listening to the forest. I kept thinking I heard footsteps outside, or maybe it was just animals moving. Every creak of the cabin made me tense, but nothing came of it. The second day, I decided to explore the surrounding area. The forest was dense, and the trees were tall, blocking most of the sunlight. I followed a faint trail that seemed to lead deeper into the woods. The farther I went, the more I realized how isolated I was. There were no other paths, no sounds of human activity, nothing except the rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a distant bird. I found an old, abandoned shed with walls collapsing in places, and I poked around inside. There were remnants of old tools, some rotting boxes, and a thick layer of dust covering everything. It made me feel a little uneasy, the thought that someone else had been here before, then vanished. As I headed back to the cabin, I noticed the sky changing. Thick clouds rolled in quickly, dark and heavy. The wind picked up, bending the trees, and I realized I needed to get back before a storm hit. The forest seemed different in the approaching storm, darker and oppressive. The trail I had followed wasn't easy to see anymore, and I had to be careful not to trip over roots or rocks hidden in the undergrowth. I felt a tight knot in my stomach as the wind howled around me. By the time I reached the cabin, my clothes were soaked, my boots heavy with mud, and my heart was racing. I secured the cabin as best I could, closing the windows, stacking some wood near the door, and sitting by the stove to dry off. The storm hit hard shortly after, rain lashing against the roof, thunder shaking the walls, lightning flashing through the windows. It was intense, almost frightening, but also mesmerizing in its raw force. I stayed up most of the night listening to it, the sound of rain pounding and the wind screaming through the trees. At some point, I realized the back window, the one facing the forest, had a crack in it where the wind was pushing through. I tried to stuff something in it, but the gusts were strong, and I gave up, choosing instead to stay away from it as much as possible. On the third day, the storm had passed, leaving the forest drenched and the air heavy with the smell of wet earth and pine. I thought about packing up and leaving, but a strange curiosity kept me there. I wanted to explore more, to see what else was hidden in the forest. I ventured out again, this time following a small creek that ran not far from the cabin. The water was clear, but the ground was slippery and uneven. At one point, I slipped and almost fell in. I grabbed a branch to steady myself, and the sound of it cracking echoed through the forest. I froze, imagining someone watching me from behind the trees, but of course there was no one. As I moved along the creek, I noticed signs that the area was not entirely empty of human presence. There were faint footprints in the mud, partially washed away by the storm, and some discarded plastic wrappers. It made me uneasy, the thought that someone else had been here recently, someone who didn't leave a trail back to civilization. The forest felt bigger, darker, and somehow more menacing as I continued walking. I decided not to follow the creek too far, turning back toward the cabin. That night, I heard it again, the sound of footsteps outside. It wasn't the wind this time, and it wasn't an animal. The soft crunching of dirt and leaves was deliberate, careful, like someone moving quietly around the cabin. I froze, listening. The sound circled the cabin, sometimes stopping, sometimes moving again. My heart raced, my palms were sweaty, and I could barely breathe. I grabbed my knife, feeling its weight in my hand, and moved toward the window to peer outside. The forest was dark, the trees swaying in the night breeze, but I saw nothing. The footsteps stopped as suddenly as they had started, leaving only silence. I couldn't sleep after that. I stayed by the stove, flashlight in hand, listening for anything unusual. Hours passed, and eventually, exhaustion took over, dragging me into a restless sleep. I dreamed of the forest closing in, of hands grabbing at me from the darkness, and I woke up in a cold sweat, heart pounding. When I looked outside, it was morning. The forest was calm, silent again, but the sense of being watched remained. The decision to leave came quickly that morning. I packed everything with more urgency than before, checking and rechecking that I hadn't left anything behind. I wanted to leave the cabin behind, wanted the distance between me and that forest to grow as large as possible. I didn't follow the same route I had taken before. I stuck to the main dirt road, careful to stay alert to any signs of movement in the trees. My eyes darted constantly, my ears straining to catch even the slightest sound. Hours passed before I saw any sign of civilization. A distant road appeared, asphalt this time, worn but recognizable. I kept walking until I reached a gas station on the edge of a small town. I looked back toward the forest one last time. The trees loomed silently, endless and unknowable. I felt a mixture of relief and lingering fear, the kind that doesn't go away quickly. The town felt suffocating at first after the openness of the forest, but I didn't care. I just needed to be around people, to know that I wasn't alone. In the days that followed, I tried to rationalize the fear. Maybe it had been animals, maybe the storm had played tricks on my mind, maybe it had just been my imagination. But even as I told myself these things, I knew the forest was not a safe place for someone who was alone and unprepared. The experience changed me. I became more aware of how easily vulnerability could creep up on you, how small decisions could make a huge difference. I returned to the city and eventually to my routine, but the memory of that cabin stayed with me. I thought about the footsteps outside, the storm, the silence that pressed against me at night. I learned to respect isolation, to respect the unknown. And though life went on, I never forgot the tension, the fear, and the strange mixture of awe and dread that the forest had left behind. Months later, I found myself reading the news about a man who had gone missing in a forest not far from where my cabin had been. Details were scarce, but the description matched the area almost exactly. I felt a chill, a reminder that the fear I had experienced was real, and that being alone in a place so remote could be dangerous beyond imagination. I resolved never to go back, never to underestimate the quiet, the shadows, and the people who might be lurking where no one else can see. The memory of that weekend never left me. I still remember the smell of wet earth, the creak of the floorboards, the shadows moving with the firelight. It was a reminder that the world is larger and stranger than the small city streets, that danger can hide in silence, and that being prepared is not just about food and knives, but about respect for the unknown and constant vigilance. I never went back to a cabin alone, and I never will. The fear was real, and so was the lesson it left me. The forest can be beautiful, quiet, and inviting, but it can also be unforgiving, and sometimes survival depends on nothing more than staying alert and knowing when to leave. I had been looking forward to this weekend for months. The stress from work had been crushing me, and the idea of escaping to a small, isolated cabin in the mountains felt like the only way to breathe. The cabin wasn't far from the main road, maybe an hour's drive, but far enough that I wouldn't hear traffic, neighbors, or anything else that reminded me of the city. When I arrived, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows over the dirt path leading to the cabin. The road had been narrow and winding, lined with dense trees, and I had barely seen another car the entire way. The isolation was immediate and intense, and I liked it. The cabin itself was small but sturdy, built mostly of rough timber. With a stone chimney on one side, it looked as though it had been there for decades. There was no internet, no phone reception, and I could tell that electricity, if it existed, came from a small generator. It had a living area with a fireplace, a small kitchen, one bedroom, and a bathroom. I unpacked quickly, placing my things neatly on the table and floor, just as I like to do when I arrived somewhere new. I made a mental note to check the generator and the stove to make sure I would be able to cook and stay warm. By the time I finished, the sky had turned a deep orange, and the first stars were beginning to appear. I decided to take a walk around the property before it got fully dark. The cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded on all sides by tall, thick trees. The underbrush was dense, and the ground was uneven. I noticed animal tracks in the mud, maybe deer or a large dog, but I couldn't be sure. The silence around me was almost deafening. I walked slowly, trying to notice every sound, every movement, because even though I felt safe, something about being completely alone in the woods made me hyper-aware. As darkness settled, I went back to the cabin and started a fire in the fireplace. The warmth was comforting, but it also cast strange shadows across the walls. I prepared a simple dinner, heating some canned food over the small stove, and then sat near the fire, staring at the flickering flames. That was when I first noticed the noises outside. At first, it was subtle. A crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves, maybe a small animal moving through the underbrush. But then, I started hearing something else. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, not like an animal, not random at all. My heart started racing. I convinced myself it was probably just a deer or some other forest creature. But the footsteps were too heavy, too precise, moving closer and closer to the cabin. I checked the locks on the doors and windows. Everything was secured, but the unease didn't go away. I moved to the window and peeked outside. The darkness was so complete that I couldn't see anything beyond the immediate clearing. Then I saw it. A shadow, moving just at the edge of the light from the cabin. Something, or someone, watching me. I froze. My mind raced. Who could be out here? The nearest neighbors were miles away. I hadn't seen anyone drive up the road when I arrived. I considered calling the police, but I had no cell service, and there was no landline in the cabin. The only option was to wait it out and stay quiet, hoping whoever or whatever it was would leave. Hours passed. The footsteps never came closer, but they never went away either. They circled the cabin, sometimes stopping for long stretches, then starting again. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was some lost hiker or a hunter, maybe someone who had wandered too far. But the rational part of my brain wasn't convincing the fear in my body. I stayed awake all night, sitting by the fire, listening, watching the shadows. By morning, the footsteps had vanished. The next day, I decided to explore the surrounding area, hoping to understand my environment better and maybe see signs of the person who had been outside. I walked carefully, noting the tracks I saw in the dirt. There were large, booted footprints near the edge of the clearing, definitely human. But there was something odd about them. They weren't random. They circled the cabin, stopping at precise points, almost like someone was studying it. I spent the day walking, trying to keep calm, but the feeling of being watched never left me. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig made me jump. By the evening, I was exhausted, but I forced myself to light another fire and eat. The darkness fell fast in the mountains, and the shadows seemed deeper than the night before. I made sure every door and window was locked, and I placed heavy furniture against them just in case. That night, the footsteps returned. They started softly, then grew louder, circling the cabin again. I could hear breathing, low and deliberate, and I realized with a jolt that this was no animal. Whoever it was, they were testing me, trying to scare me, and I had no way to defend myself effectively. I searched the cabin for something to use as a weapon. There was a small axe near the fireplace, probably intended for splitting wood. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. I held it tightly, moving from room to room, listening for the intruder. Hours passed, and then I heard it. A loud knock at the door, followed by silence. My heart jumped, my muscles tensed. I didn't move. After a few minutes, I heard scratching, like someone trying to pry the door open. I gripped the axe harder, waiting. Then suddenly, everything stopped. Silence again, except for my own breathing and the crackle of the fire. I stayed awake until dawn. When the first light filtered through the trees, I cautiously looked outside. The clearing was empty, except for the footprints, which were still visible in the mud. They led away from the cabin and disappeared into the forest. I didn't follow them. I knew I had no way to confront whoever had been out there, and I didn't want to risk another encounter. The following day, I decided I couldn't stay. The fear was too intense, and the sense of vulnerability was overwhelming. I packed quickly, taking only essentials, and drove back down the mountain. The road felt long and winding, and every shadow in the trees made me tense. When I finally reached the main road, I felt a wave of relief that I hadn't felt in 2 days. Back home, I contacted the local police and reported the incident. I gave them as many details as I could. The location of the cabin, the approximate time, the footprints, the noises, everything. They told me that the area had a history of trespassers and that it wasn't unusual for people to hike in the mountains illegally, sometimes to commit crimes. They promised to have patrols in the area and to check the cabin. In the following days, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The fear of being watched, of being approached while completely alone, stayed with me. But I also realized something important. I had survived. I had stayed calm enough to protect myself, to avoid confrontation, and to get away. That clarity gave me a sense of control I hadn't had during the nights at the cabin. A few weeks later, I received a call from the local sheriff's department. They had investigated the cabin and found evidence of someone breaking in around the time I had been there. There were signs of forced entry on the back door, but no one had been caught. They advised that the area was being monitored more closely now. I never went back to the cabin, and I never intended to. But the experience stayed with me, not just as fear, but as a reminder of the importance of preparation, awareness, and caution when in isolated areas. I started researching safer ways to enjoy the outdoors alone. I learned about survival techniques, how to secure a cabin, how to create signals for help, and how to protect myself if I ever found myself alone again. The experience changed me. I wasn't reckless anymore, but I wasn't paralyzed by fear either. I understood the reality of danger in a way that books and movies could never teach. And though I never wanted to feel that paralyzing fear again, I was grateful for the clarity it gave me. I had faced a real threat and I had survived it. That knowledge became a quiet strength I carried with me. Even now, when I drive past that area, I remember the isolation, the footsteps circling the cabin, and the cold grip of fear that had settled over me. But I also remember how I prepared, how I stayed vigilant, and how I got out safely. The fear no longer controls me, it informs me, and that difference has made all the difference in the world. I had planned the cabin trip for weeks, choosing a remote spot deep in the mountains, far from cell towers, far from people, far from everything that might remind me of my normal life. I needed the solitude, the kind that made the world feel small and simple. The cabin was tucked between dense pine trees, just above a small, rocky creek. It had been empty for months before I rented it, and that was exactly what I wanted. A place untouched, isolated. I drove for hours down a winding dirt road that twisted through the mountains. The forest closed in on both sides of the car, thick and dark, the canopy blotting out the sky as if the sun itself had been swallowed. When I finally reached the cabin, the wooden structure seemed even more alone than I expected. The porch sagged slightly, the boards cracked under my boots, and the windows were cloudy with dirt and dust. I carried my bag inside, noticing the lingering smell of old wood and faint mildew. The fireplace was cold, but I found dry kindling in the corner. The shelves had a few chipped dishes, a rusty kettle, and an old, dusty coffee pot. I placed my things down, locked the door, and started unpacking slowly, savoring the silence. The first night was quiet, except for the creek running nearby and the occasional rustle of animals in the underbrush. I slept on the thin mattress in the small bedroom, listening to the wind push through the trees. I felt comfortable in my isolation. But when I woke in the middle of the night, I realized something subtle had shifted. The silence had become heavier, more oppressive, as if the woods were watching me. At first, I told myself it was the usual creaks and groans of an old cabin settling. Then, I thought I heard a sound from outside, a faint scraping against the boards on the porch. My stomach tightened. I got out of bed quietly and checked the window. The moonlight barely lit the trees, and I saw nothing but shadows. I convinced myself it was a branch rubbing against the wall, or maybe a deer. Still, my heart raced longer than it should have, and I returned to bed uneasy. The next day, I tried to distract myself with chores around the cabin. I cleaned the dust from the shelves, stacked firewood, and brought water from the creek, careful not to spill it on the muddy bank. The isolation was strange. The sun filtered through the pine trees in patterns I hadn't noticed before, and everything was eerily still. The only signs of life were birds or the occasional squirrel. But that evening, while making a small fire, I noticed something I hadn't before. Footprints near the edge of the clearing around the cabin. They were shallow, almost like they had been made by someone careful, moving quietly through the mud. I froze, staring at them. They weren't mine. I traced them carefully. They came from the tree line, circled the cabin, and disappeared back into the forest. My pulse quickened. I had no neighbors for miles. Nobody should have been here. I checked the locks on the doors and windows. Everything was fine. Still, a chill ran down my back that no blanket could warm. Over the next 2 days, the tension grew. Every sound seemed amplified. The cracking of a branch sounded like someone walking directly behind me. A gust of wind brushing against the window sounded like a knock. I started double-checking the locks constantly, moving quietly, watching the edges of the trees. One night, I woke to a sound that made my blood run cold. A slow, deliberate scratching on the side of the cabin. It was steady, almost patient, like someone was testing the structure, trying to find a way in. I lay frozen, straining to hear over my own heartbeat. Then it stopped. I waited, holding my breath, listening to nothing for what felt like an hour. I couldn't sleep after that. The following morning, I decided to explore the area more carefully. I needed to understand if someone had been here before me or if I was imagining things. I followed the creek upstream, noting the disturbed soil along the banks. There were more footprints, larger ones, deeper than the first ones. They led into the forest, then vanished. I circled back to the cabin, feeling a creeping sense of being watched. I started noticing things I had missed. Small twigs broken unnaturally, the smell of smoke lingering faintly even though I hadn't seen any fire, and the scuff marks near the back door. The forest, which had seemed peaceful and protective at first, now felt like it was closing in. I spent another restless night inside the cabin, barricading the doors with furniture and staying as quiet as possible. Sleep was impossible. Every sound, the wind, the creak, even the faint scurrying of a mouse, made me jump. By the next morning, I felt like I hadn't slept in days. My mind was jittery, focused entirely on the possibility of someone else being here, though I hadn't actually seen anyone. I started planning my escape in case I had to run. I memorized the route down the dirt road, the turns, the rocks I could use to steady myself if I had to run quickly. Then it happened. Around noon, while I was outside fetching water, I saw movement between the trees. A man appeared briefly, dressed in dark clothes, his face obscured. He seemed to be watching me, just standing still among the trees. I froze, my mouth dry. He didn't move toward me, but he didn't leave either. Then he vanished as quickly as he had appeared. I didn't run immediately. I didn't want to provoke him, but I returned to the cabin with my heart racing. The door was still locked. I thought about calling the police, but there was no signal. I realized I was entirely alone and entirely vulnerable. For the next 2 days, I stayed inside almost continuously, checking the windows, doors, and every possible way someone could enter. I kept the fire going in case I needed light, and I made sure my knife was accessible at all times. Every night I lay awake listening to the forest, and every night I heard scratching, rustling, and the faintest footsteps around the cabin. By the third night, I noticed that food and small items inside the cabin had been moved slightly, just enough that I could tell someone had been inside while I wasn't looking. Panic set in fully. I realized I couldn't stay there. I made a plan to leave. At dawn, I packed all of my belongings, stripped the cabin of anything that could be of interest, and prepared for the long walk back down the mountain. I moved carefully, checking the tree line for signs of anyone watching. The forest was quiet, but I knew it could be a trap. Step by step, I descended, keeping my eyes on every shadow, my ears tuned to the slightest sound. After an hour, I reached the dirt road and finally saw my car. Relief hit me so hard I almost collapsed. I didn't stop moving until I was on the paved highway, far from the forest, far from the cabin. After that trip, I never returned to the cabin. I reported the incidents to the local authorities, who said that people occasionally break into abandoned cabins, sometimes hiding out for days. They took my statement and searched the area, but they never found the person who had been watching me. I never went back to the mountains alone, and I never stayed somewhere I couldn't see everyone around me. I kept thinking about how close I had come to a real disaster, how easy it would have been for someone to hurt me in that isolated place. The experience left me nervous for months, unable to sleep without checking every lock, but it also made me wiser. I learned how careful one must be in the wilderness, how quickly isolation can turn from peace into danger, and how important it is to respect the reality that other people may be out there with intentions you cannot predict. The memory of that cabin, the creek, the trees, the faint scratches at night, stayed with me for years. I would pass similar forests and feel my heart tighten, my senses sharpen, remembering that helpless feeling of being alone but not alone at the same time. I became more aware of my surroundings, more cautious about trusting silence and solitude. That trip taught me a hard lesson, one I would never forget. Being alone can feel like freedom, but in the wrong circumstances, it can become a dangerous trap. And yet, despite all the fear, I survived, returned to safety, and learned from the experience in ways that made me stronger, more prepared, and more aware of the hidden dangers that can exist even in the quietest, most peaceful places. I remember the drive up the narrow, winding mountain road, the kind of road that felt like it had been carved into the side of the cliff decades ago and barely maintained since. I was heading to a cabin I had rented for a long weekend, a remote place I had found online that promised isolation, quiet, and a break from the endless noise of city life. The reviews had been sparse but glowing. People described mornings filled with the smell of pine, evenings with nothing but the sound of wind and the occasional bird, and nights dark enough to make the stars look closer than they ever did in town. I was looking forward to it. I wanted solitude, a chance to disconnect. The last stretch of the road was dirt, with loose gravel making the car slide slightly as I maneuvered around potholes and washed-out patches. The sun was already low in the sky, the shadows of tall fir trees stretching across the road like thin black fingers. I noticed how quiet it had become, the usual hum of distant cars or people gone, replaced by the crisp whisper of wind through branches. My phone had no signal for miles, but I didn't mind. I wanted this. I needed this. The cabin came into view as the road curved around a bend. It was modest, made of rough-hewn logs, with a steep roof and a small porch. A stone chimney rose from one side, and a thin wisp of smoke curled from it. There was a small, overgrown path leading from the driveway to the edge of the forest, but otherwise the clearing around the cabin was empty. No neighbors, no other cabins. Just the trees and the cabin. I parked my car on the dirt and got out, the smell of damp earth and pine filling the air. The door opened easily, and inside, the cabin was simple but welcoming. Wooden walls and floors, a small kitchen with a gas stove, a table and chairs that looked hand-carved, and a single bedroom with a bed and a thick quilt. There was a fireplace in the living area, a stack of firewood neatly arranged nearby. I set my backpack down and walked to the window, looking out at the trees. They moved with a slow, deliberate sway in the wind, and for a moment, I felt a sense of peace. I spent the next hour unpacking and exploring. There was a small shelf with a few books, mostly old novels and some nature guides. The bathroom had a shower with hot water, which I tested immediately. Everything seemed functional, well kept despite the cabin's remote location. As the light faded, I lit a few lamps and started a fire in the fireplace. The first crackle of burning would made the cabin feel warmer, more like a home. Night fell quickly in the mountains. What had been a soft orange glow from the sun turned to deep navy, then black. The forest outside became a wall of shadows. I had brought a small flashlight and set it on the kitchen counter, along with some snacks and bottled water. I had planned to read for a while, maybe write in my journal, then go to bed early. That first night, I slept lightly. The sounds of the forest were strange to me. The rustle of branches, the snap of twigs underfoot, the occasional distant call of an animal. Every small noise seemed amplified in the stillness. At one point, I woke to the sound of something heavy moving across the clearing outside. My heart rate spiked, but I reminded myself that it was probably a deer or a raccoon. I stayed in bed, listening until the sound faded. The next day, I decided to hike one of the trails that started near the cabin. I packed water, snacks, a map, and my flashlight just in case. The trail was steep and narrow, winding between massive pine trees and over rocky terrain. Birds called overhead, and occasionally, I glimpsed a deer darting through the underbrush. The trail was harder than I expected, the loose rocks and roots making each step require care. The sense of isolation was intense. I saw no other people, no signs of civilization. By midday, I had reached a small clearing that offered a view of the valley below. The wind was strong, cold, and it carried a faint smell of something earthy, like wet soil and moss. On the way back, I noticed something strange. The trail didn't look exactly like I remembered. A section of path that had been clear the first time seemed partially overgrown, the trees closer together than before. I thought I might have taken a wrong turn. I pulled out the map, comparing it to the surroundings. The trail should have curved around a ridge and led straight back to the cabin. Instead, I found myself in a narrow corridor of trees that ended in a steep drop-off on one side. I realized I had wandered slightly off the main trail. I retraced my steps carefully. Every step sounded loud, my footfalls echoing in the empty forest. Then I heard something else. A series of slow, deliberate cracks, like someone walking, though the ground was too soft and uneven for a human stride to sound that way. My stomach tightened. I stopped, listening, but all I could hear was my own breathing and the wind. When I started walking again, I took care to make noise, hoping whatever it was would know I was there and leave. I finally reached the cabin as the sun was beginning to sink again. Relief washed over me. The cabin looked the same, but now the isolation felt heavier, more oppressive. That night, I kept the fire burning longer, checking the locks on the doors and windows repeatedly. Outside, the wind had picked up, and branches scraped against the walls. I could hear small animals moving in the underbrush, but there was something else, something heavier, that made my skin crawl. Over the next 2 days, I stayed mostly inside, reluctant to go far. I brought in firewood, explored the small storage shed behind the cabin, and kept a close eye on the surrounding forest. I tried to keep myself busy. I cleaned the cabin, organized my things, cooked meals over the stove, and read from the old novels. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. I kept catching glimpses of movement at the edge of my vision. A shadow darting behind a tree, a flicker of movement in the darkness. The sense of unease came to a head on the third night. I had gone to check the storage shed for more firewood. The shed was small, with a single wooden door that creaked loudly as I opened it. Inside, it was mostly empty, just some tools, an old rake, and a stack of firewood. I grabbed a few logs and turned to leave. That's when I heard it. A thump, then another, coming from the back of the shed. I froze. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure it would give me away. I shined my flashlight toward the noise. Nothing. I stepped cautiously toward the back wall. Then I saw it. Footprints in the dirt floor of the shed. Large, heavy, human-shaped, leading from the back corner toward the door I had just opened. I realized with a shock that someone had been inside the shed before me. My mind raced. The cabin was supposed to be isolated. There were no neighbors, no caretakers, at least none that I knew about. The footprints stopped at the door, and outside, the earth showed no sign of footprints leading away. Whoever had been there must have gone into the woods. I carried the firewood inside quickly and locked the shed door. I checked the cabin doors and windows, making sure everything was secure. I stayed awake that night, the flashlight beside my bed, the fire burning brightly. Every sound outside, every rustle, every snap, made me tense. I didn't sleep much. The following morning, I decided I had to leave, but my car wouldn't start. The battery was dead. I had left it running a bit too long the night before while I loaded firewood, and the cold mountain air had drained the battery completely. Panic set in. The nearest town was miles down a rough road, and with no cell signal, I couldn't call for help. I had to find a way to get to the main road. I packed some supplies: water, food, a first aid kit, and a flashlight. I considered following the trail I had hiked before, but the thought of getting lost again, or worse, encountering whoever had been in the shed, made me hesitate. Instead, I tried the road. The dirt path leading from the cabin to the main road was overgrown and steep, but I had no choice. I started walking carefully, keeping my eyes on the forest and listening for any signs of movement. Hours passed. The sun was high and then began its slow descent. My legs ached, my pack weighed heavily, and every shadow seemed to hold something watching me. At one point, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. Not light, careful steps, but heavy, deliberate ones, matching my pace. I stopped and turned quickly. Nothing. I moved again, faster this time, listening intently. The sound followed. I broke into a jog. The sound became faster, matching mine. My mind screamed that I was being followed. Finally, after what felt like endless hours, I reached a small clearing. The main road was visible beyond a line of trees. Relief washed over me, but it was tempered by exhaustion and fear. I ran the last stretch, stumbling over rocks and roots, until I finally reached the road. There, a truck appeared, coming slowly up the incline. I waved my arms frantically. The driver stopped and rolled down the window. After explaining the situation in quick gestures and frantic movements, the driver nodded and offered me a ride down to the nearest town. We drove slowly, the truck rattling over the rough dirt road. I looked back at the forest, the cabin far behind, the trees standing silent and motionless. When we reached the town, I called a friend to bring jumper cables for my car. Later, I returned with help, But the cabin felt different now, like it had been hiding secrets I had only glimpsed. The shed, the footprints, the sounds at night. They were all real, human, and terrifying, yet I would never know exactly what had happened. In the end, I didn't go back to the cabin. I sold the rental agreement, warning the owner about the previous presence in the shed. I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was hiding something, and I didn't want to test it again. But I did learn something about myself. About fear, endurance, and the strange, unnerving feeling of being truly alone in the wilderness, knowing that somewhere nearby, someone else might be watching. Even now, I can picture the cabin, the shadows of the trees, the overgrown trail, and the footprints in the dirt. I know I survived, and I am safe, but the memory of that isolation, the unknown presence, and the dark forest will never leave me. It stays with me, quiet, constant, like a reminder that the world is larger than our small, safe spaces, and that some parts of it are better left unexplored. I had been planning this cabin trip for months. The work had piled up to the point where I felt completely drained, physically and mentally. The kind of exhaustion where your bones ache and your mind refuses to stop racing. I had convinced myself that a week alone in the woods, completely cut off from phones and the internet, would be the reset I desperately needed. The cabin I rented was deep in the forest, far from any small town or highway. It was an old log structure, built decades ago, with a wide porch facing a small lake. The reviews had mentioned that it was quiet, isolated, and peaceful. That sounded perfect. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sun hanging low over the trees, casting long shadows across the gravel road. The drive had been long and winding, past miles of dense forest, streams, and abandoned cabins that had clearly fallen into disrepair. When I finally reached the cabin, I felt a rush of relief. It was even more remote than I imagined, surrounded by thick trees that blocked out the view of any other roads or houses. The lake in front of the cabin reflected the golden sunset, its surface still and smooth. I parked my car, stepped out, and immediately noticed the smell of damp wood mixed with pine. The air was crisp, with the faint scent of decaying leaves. The cabin itself was rustic but functional. The porch had a rocking chair that creaked slightly in the breeze, and inside, the main room had a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, and a single bathroom. There were 2 bedrooms, one with a queen-sized bed and the other with 2 single beds. Everything was clean but old, the kind of old that carries the weight of years of use, with wooden floors that groaned under your weight and walls that had tiny cracks. I unpacked my things slowly, enjoying the silence that was almost deafening after months in the city. There was no phone signal, which I expected, but it still made me uneasy for a brief moment. I reminded myself that was exactly why I had come here. No notifications, no emails, no interruptions. Just me, the cabin, and the forest. As night fell, I lit the fireplace. The crackle of the fire was comforting, and I spent the evening reading a book I had brought. Outside, the forest seemed alive in a way I wasn't used to. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a branch, sounded amplified. I told myself it was just animals, deer, raccoons, maybe a fox, but I could feel my nerves tightening slightly, a reminder that I was alone in a place where help would be hours away if something went wrong. I went to bed early, exhausted from the drive. Around midnight, I woke to a sound that made my stomach drop. It was faint at first, like something dragging across the porch. I froze, straining to hear over the crackle of the dying fire. Another sound came, a soft thump, then silence. My mind raced. I told myself it had to be an animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray dog. I considered peeking through the curtains but decided against it, thinking it would just be some random nocturnal creature. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I fell back asleep, though lightly, every noise jolting me awake. The next morning, I went outside to survey the area. Everything seemed normal. There were tracks in the dirt around the porch, small, maybe a rabbit or a fox. Nothing that suggested anything more sinister. The forest was still, almost unnaturally quiet. I made coffee, watched the sunlight glint off the lake, and tried to push the uneasy feeling aside. I reminded myself that being alone in the woods would naturally make anyone jumpy. Over the next few days, I settled into a routine. I went hiking along the trails near the cabin, swam in the lake during the afternoon, and spent evenings by the fire. The isolation was peaceful at first, and I began to feel a sense of relief I hadn't felt in years. But the sense of unease never fully went away. It wasn't constant, but sometimes I would catch a glimpse of movement just beyond my line of sight, or hear a sound that made me tense without reason. One evening, while walking along the edge of the forest behind the cabin, I saw a shadow move between the trees. It was quick, but deliberate, unlike the flutter of birds or the movement of deer. My heart jumped, but when I stepped closer, there was nothing. I told myself it was my imagination. That night, the sounds on the porch returned, louder and more distinct. I could hear scraping along the wood, almost as if someone or something was testing the door. I sat upright in bed, staring at the dark window, my pulse pounding. I had a flashlight on the nightstand, but I hesitated to use it. Turning it on would show whoever or whatever it was that I was awake. The sounds continued intermittently for about 30 minutes before stopping. Eventually, I convinced myself it was an animal that had gotten curious. The next day, I found evidence that made me pause. On the porch, there were small, muddy footprints that hadn't been there before. They were human-sized, but narrow, as if someone had walked carefully, trying not to leave too much trace. Panic set in. I went around the cabin, checking doors and windows. Everything was locked, but the footprints were undeniable. Someone had been close enough to the cabin to leave them. The thought made my stomach twist. How had they gotten here? There was no road nearby except the one I drove in on, and it would take hours for anyone to reach this isolated spot. I spent the rest of the day scanning the forest from the porch, carrying a long branch I found for protection. The sun began to set, and I felt my sense of isolation deepen into fear. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a hiker who had wandered off trail, but the deliberate nature of the footprints suggested otherwise. That night, I slept lightly, keeping the flashlight and branch beside me. On the third night, the intruder returned. I woke to the sound of footsteps on the porch, slow and careful. My heart raced. I grabbed the flashlight, threw back the curtain, and shone it outside. The beam fell on a figure crouched near the edge of the porch. For a moment, I thought it was someone watching me, but then it moved back into the shadows and disappeared. I froze, my mind racing. I couldn't call for help, no phone signal, no neighbors. I felt trapped. The sounds continued intermittently, scraping against the wood and shifting outside. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I searched the area around the cabin. There were more footprints, now circling the cabin, moving in patterns that suggested someone had been watching for days. I realized this wasn't a random trespasser. This was someone who knew how to stay hidden and patient. The forest had become hostile, and I felt completely vulnerable. I debated leaving immediately, but the cabin was far from the main road, and my car was parked where it could be seen easily. The thought of encountering whoever had been circling the cabin while I tried to drive out terrified me. Over the next 2 days, I reinforced the doors and windows as best I could. I set up makeshift barriers, wedged furniture against doors, and even laid a few sticks and branches in areas where footprints had appeared, hoping to detect movement. I stayed vigilant, scanning the forest constantly. The intruder didn't appear during daylight, which gave me brief respite, but every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made me tense, ready for whoever or whatever it was. On the 5th night, I had an idea. I remembered the small, old shed at the far edge of the property, about 50 meters from the cabin. If I could create some kind of trap or alert there, maybe I could gain time to escape if the intruder returned. I gathered nails, some rope, and old cans, setting them up so that movement in the forest would create noise. It was primitive, but it was the only chance I had to detect someone before they reached the cabin. That night, around midnight, the intruder came again. I heard the first snap from the trap near the shed. It was faint but unmistakable. My pulse shot through the roof. I grabbed the branch and flashlight, ready to confront whoever it was, though I knew I was unarmed against a real threat. I stayed inside, watching the porch, flashlight sweeping the edges of the forest. For an hour, I saw nothing. Then I noticed movement between the trees. A shadow moved along the trap, setting off more noise. Whoever it was moved cautiously, clearly aware of the setup. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the intruder retreated. I didn't see them leave, but the rustling faded into the distance. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn, scanning the forest. When morning came, I saw the footprints leading away from the cabin, back toward the road I had come from. Relief washed over me, but I didn't lower my guard. The following morning, I decided I couldn't risk staying another night. I packed quickly, checked the cabin one last time, and loaded my car. As I drove away, I kept scanning the roadside, hyper-aware of every movement in the trees. The sense of relief didn't fully hit until I reached the main highway and saw other cars. I didn't stop until I reached a small town, called the authorities, and reported the trespassing, though I doubted anything would come of it. Looking back, the experience had changed me. The forest, which I had thought of as peaceful and restorative, had felt predatory. The isolation, the sounds, the unseen presence watching me. It had forced me to confront vulnerability in a way I had never experienced before. I realized that no matter how prepared you think you are, human presence in isolation carries risks you can't always control. The cabin trip had been intended as a reset, but it had turned into a test of my own awareness, resilience, and instinct to survive. I still love the woods, still visit remote places sometimes, but I am far more cautious. I always make sure someone knows my location, never underestimate isolation, and never assume the forest is empty. That cabin trip remains the most terrifying experience of my life, a reminder that danger can be real, silent, and patient, and sometimes survival depends on nothing more than careful observation, quick thinking, and the will to keep moving until you are truly safe.